Good evening. I am now going to call the August 24th work session of the Bend Lapine Schools Board of Directors to order as agenda item 1. To begin, because we are doing this meeting remotely, I will be taking roll call. Amy Tatum.
Here.
Carrie McPherson Douglas. Carrie, are you here?
I believe Carrie is on a phone call to another board member.
Okay, great. I'll circle back. Yanette Sarari Yerandi Gonzalez.
I'm here.
Marcus Legrand.
Yeah.
Present.
Shamika Montgomery.
Here.
Shirley Olson is trying to connect, and then I will come back to Carrie. Are you on? All right. I am here. We have 5 people that have stated that they are here, and so we have quorum, and we know that Carrie and Shirley are both joining us tonight, and they will do so shortly. We will now move on to the review of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda as agenda item 2?
There are no changes. We did add one piece of information late in the day today as an additional item for the superintendent's report regarding the conversation around lunches. And that was a late addition today. So I just want to draw attention to that.
Great, thank you. Board members, are there any changes? Great, then we will move forward with our agenda. As a note for our stakeholders, we do not take public comment during our work sessions. This is an opportunity for the board to engage in discussion on key board work and initiatives. Public comment is taken at the monthly regular meetings of the board, typically held the second Tuesday of each month. We will now move forward with agenda item 3 regarding the declaration of surplus property and proposed sale. I will hand this over to Mike Tiller, Executive Director of Facilities, to lead us in this.
Actually, Melissa, I'll take the first piece of this and then quickly turn it over to Mike. My role is going to be, my name is Brad Henry. I'm the Operations and Financial Officer. Good evening, everybody. I am going to quickly share my screen, bring up Deschutes County Dial, and try to get us all oriented as far as where this property is located. If I can do this. Sorry, that's not right. Janet, I'm going to be in trouble because I'm not able to do this, so I'm going to have to let Tiller go ahead and show the exhibits. So Mike,
I could try to pull up Dial relatively quickly if you all want to wait for a second here and see if I can get it to go, Brad.
That'd be great.
All right, let me give it a shot here.
I'll kind of talk you through while he's bringing it up. This, what we have are, I think you're all aware of where Caldero High School is located. The property is about 78 acres total. We built the high school on approximately 50 acres of that. The southernmost part of that property is the high school. The northernmost would be what we had identified as a potential middle school site in the future. As we built out the site for the high school, one of the requirements was to build a road going east to west from 15th Street over to Broster House. In building that road, as we designed it, there are small remnants of the property that are left. And so we can show. How you doing, Mike?
Well, I'm not doing very good at all. I don't know why. It was working earlier, but I'm not seeing it here. It won't show the Google, the web page.
Janet, are you able to take from our board packet those screens and show them the exhibits that Mike and Brad put forward?
I mean, it won't even let me share my PDF files here, guys, which is not the way it was working earlier today when I tried it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't share, but somebody else can try to share it because I'm running the YouTube. I can't share my page.
Okay. Oh, feel like I'm seeing something.
That's me trying to share one off my desktop. Okay, I've got it here.
I think you've got it.
As long as it'll show me multiple pages.
Mm-hmm.
This is just the first page.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have here. So there are two parcels, and this is going to be very difficult for you guys to see without having the Google, kind of the Google Earth image. But we've got Caldera Drive that connects on the north end of the new high school, the north end of that property where the fields are. It connects around into Broster House Road. Okay, so it kind of snakes around the property and connects in there. And it connects just south of the railroad tracks and the undercrossing that's there. And there's four properties along that from where it connects into Broster House to the undercrossing. So we reached out to the property owners along there because the only real usable thing for this piece of land is for the homeowners, because you cannot access it off of Caldera because that's a collector road. So the only access is through the properties on Broster House Road. So there are two of the homeowners responded when we marketed it to them. We didn't market it to any other public agencies because they cannot be their own legal lots. So this is really the only use. And so two of the property owners expressed interest. And so there's two different sizes of property here. And what we're asking you to do is we have absolutely no use for these because they're so small. They're in between the school and the road. And so we're asking you to surplus these so that we can then go ahead and sell them to the homeowners that are interested.
And everyone has the visuals as in their board book as 3B.1 and 3B.2. So if you actually click into Exhibit A for each of those, you're able to see the actual plots that Mike is discussing.
So are there any questions from any of the board members? Nope. Okay. Well, I think we're asking you guys to take action on this to go ahead and surplus it then.
All right. If no one has any questions, I'm happy to move to approve the sale of the 7,348 square foot lot parcel of district remnant land at Caldera High School as described on the exhibit. This is 3B1 for $25,000.
Amy, we're going to need to back up a second first.
Okay.
And the first step that we need to do is actually declare it as surplus real property. And so the first resolution would be that it's resolution 1922 Declaration of Land Surplus. and then we will resolve to sell each of the parcels.
All right, well, I will move to approve resolution 1922, the declaration of land surplus.
I will second.
I'm sorry, who was that was seconding?
Carrie.
Great. So we have a move to approve 1922 by Amy and a second by Carrie. Is there any further discussion? Great, then we will move into roll call vote. Amy,
Yes.
Carrie,
Yes.
Yanette,
Yes.
Marcus,
Yes.
Shamiko,
Yes.
Shirley,
Yes.
and I am a yes as well, and so the resolution passes. We will now move into the sale portion of this with the move to approve the sale, both pieces, and they have to be done separately.
Okay, I'll try to share this one again to give you an idea of which piece we're talking about here. So that'll let me rotate. Oh, and of course I did it the wrong way.
I think we can see it, Mike.
Okay. So this is the first piece here, remnant 1, and we're looking to sell this parcel to the homeowner there, the Torviks. It's actually 7,348 square feet. That's what we surplused, but we're going to need a 368 square feet easement, as you can see in the blue, the light blue or purple there. And that's for snow removal. That sidewalk is curb tight, so we need a place to remove snow. We can't put it onto a city street. So the net is 6980. And again, this is really the only use for this land, given the location, the shape, and the access. And no other public entities or anyone could use it. So we're would like you to recommend a motion to allow us to sell this to the property owner.
So I will move to approve the sale of the 7,348 square foot parcel of district remnant land at Caldera High School as described on the exhibit for $25,000.
Thank you, Amy. Do we have a second?
This is Yanette. I'll second.
Great. So we have Amy as a first and Yanette as a second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing no further discussion, we will move forward with a roll call vote. Amy,
Yes.
Carrie, I will come back to Carrie. Yanette,
Yes.
Marcus?
I'm here.
Oh,
Having trouble getting off mute. I'm a yes.
okay. Marcus,
Yes.
Shamiko,
Yes.
Shirley,
Yes.
and I am a yes as well, so motion passes. Then we will move on to the second parcel.
Okay. So basically, same story we've talked about. This parcel is just a little bit larger. It's just to the north of the first one. That property owner is interested for the same reasons. And the agreed upon sales price there is $32,237 for that one.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve the second partial for sale.
Is there a second?
Second.
I'm sorry, who was that second?
Amy.
Great, thank you. So Marcus made the motion, Amy seconded. Is there any further discussion? Hearing no further discussion, we will move to a roll call vote. Amy,
Yes.
Carrie,
Yes.
Yanette,
Yes.
Marcus,
Yes.
Shamiko,
Yes.
Shirley,
Yes.
and I am a yes, so motion passes. Thank you so much, Brad and Mike, for all of your work in ensuring our facilities, and it's no easy lift during the growth that we are experiencing as a school district. So thank you for continuing to find and make the best use of our land.
Thank
for
you all.
our
You
schools.
bet. Thank you. And maybe we'll get this technology to work a little better next time.
Great.
Okay,
So
thanks.
absolutely. Excuse me. We will now move into agenda item 4, which is our policies and regulations and review. As a reminder to the public, all policies and regulations and review will now come forward to the board in a 2-step process, first for review and then for approval. Tonight, we will have 2 different pieces that are being brought forward, our travel procedure as well as our dress code. So I will hand it over to Dr. Cook.
Thank you, Melissa. So the first one let's talk about is the travel procedure. We simply are doing some minor updates to this policy, increasing the per diems, and you can see that as a part of the red line. The second policy, there's some pretty substantial changes there that we definitely want to make you aware of, and then also go out and receive some public input on those. And so we've got Kinsey Martin is available if anybody has questions that they want to go into high specifics on parts of that policy and conditions or concerns that you might have. We're also glad to stand for questions myself as well.
Great. So we'll open it up to questions from the board. Dr. Cook, I had a question raised to me regarding the dress policy and whether images and language depicting or advocating violence included guns on clothing, and if you could speak to that.
So I think one of the things that I would make sure to point out, what I'd like to do is talk about the location in the policy where its specific questions might best reside. I think here, let me see if I can pull up the draft. There's a lot of language recommended in the first kind of carved out paragraph where bullets are added, in which that students from wearing clothing with images or languages depicting or advocating violence or the use of alcohol or drugs would be minimized, and make sure that we're doing our best to create an environment around that is safe for students. Kinsey, do you want to add anything to that? Is there anything there that you feel like we should be also adding?
No, just that most of that language specifically didn't change in these recommendations.
Excuse me, this is Shirley. Would it be helpful to add weapons to that statement, to that bullet? Oh, we just got cut off. I got cut off.
No, you're on. You're on.
No,
Shirley.
you're on. You're on.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm just thinking that that might be helpful. It would be very specific. Advocating violence, use of weapons, or the use of alcohol or drugs.
And to comment on that too, in that with the bill administration talking about that, if a student decides to wear a picture of an AK-47 on there, and that's very triggering for some students, So that's my concern with that as well. You know, and especially with a lot of the students who have, with a lot of the stuff that's gone on throughout our country and continues to happen with violence and when it comes to guns, I think we definitely need to make sure that we are addressing that. And I know most people are thinking, okay, what about my Second Amendment rights? But if you are a middle schooler or a high schooler and you are not deterred to thinking that you can bring a weapon to school or even portray one on the clothing that you're currently wearing, I think we're sending a missed message there. I think we want to definitely try to make sure that we're not allowing images to really put people in a bad light. If I'm saying that correctly.
This is Kinsey. Just to clarify, I think in our conversations around the recommendations, which I just want to note again, came in large part from our students, recommending based on their experiences and some research they did. I just want to give a shout out to our students who have been working on this the past couple of years. Down in the section with the numbered items, that number 3 still maintains the, prohibiting any images or, clothing that depicts any illegal activities or that create a hostile or intimidating environment. And we intentionally left the language in there about leaving administrator discretion so that our building administrators can work through those situations and determine when, one thing might be the name of a specific brand name or something on a t-shirt versus seeing very, images that are very clear about a gun, for example, might be handled in a slightly different way. So that language around administrator discretion is and reasonable decision making there was left in for that exact reason.
So Kinsey, did you have explicit conversations about including the images that depict weapons and choose not to include that language?
We didn't have specific conversations about that just because we didn't take out anything from that language and felt at the time of our conversations that it was included in number 3 and then up in some of the bullets as far as violence. But I mean, that's certainly feedback it's good to know. Doesn't feel like it's called out very explicitly.
Kinsey, this is Janet. I also, sorry, did I cut you off, Melissa?
No, you go.
Yeah, it leaves, I think, a little bit too much room for interpretation, particularly when we're speaking about, this could be determined by the school administrator without explicit language around images of weapons. As Marcus mentioned, that seems like a very critical point to name specifically. Especially again, as we're deciding that we're leaving this up to the school administrator to sort of, be the best decision maker based on these guidelines. I think that we need to be a little bit more clear in that specific number 3.
Yeah, I imagine that our administrators would appreciate that as well. Just the more clarity for them, the better as well. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Kinsey, the way I look at it is if we are calling out drugs and alcohol because under 18s can't possess those, they can't possess guns either. And so I believe that that would be a perfectly legitimate thing to include. In addition, my one other piece is that on number 5, in terms of that prevent identification, such as face masks, except for those worn in compliance with local health directives. I still want to make sure that families, even if it's not a directive to wear face masks, are still able to. And so I'd like to see a little bit of shift in that language to make sure that it's in health directives or for health purposes.
Thank you all for that feedback. I think one thing to remind us, this is a two-step process. We'd like to submit these out to the public for public review so that our community can weigh in on those as well, and then bring those back in front of you all again after we get that feedback, and take the feedback that we've just received from you all to incorporate those things where necessary, and any of the feedback that we feel like is warranted from our community, and bring that back for your approval next month. I anticipate this will be back in front of you at the end, potentially at the end of September.
Thank you so much. Again, I truly appreciate this two-step process, which allows us to look at policies and procedures. And were you going to add something?
Yeah,
Sorry.
apologies. I wanted to jump back to a little bit further up in the document, on the last bullet point, where it says, ensure all students and staff understand that they are responsible for managing their own personal distractions without regulating individual students' clothing / self-expression. I think we need to work around the language. What my first takeaway is that it sort of puts the weight on the student if they are causing a distraction for an adult, and that's not language that I want to see worked into the dress code. And so I think we need to get a little bit more clear on that specific bullet point, and perhaps break it out in a format of student and staff, which looks very differently, I think, when we're talking specifically about dress code and what distractions look like.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, are there any other, this is my piece about whether I should be doing round robin or not. Sure. So Shirley and Shamiko, Carrie, anyone who hasn't spoken, are there other pieces that you would like to add to this?
This is Shirley. I just have not had the opportunity to carefully look at the language in our equity policies. And I just asked Kinsey if she thinks the language is compatible with what we have in other policies.
Yes, I think it's a big step in the right direction of aligning those different policies. I think the changes made here will address in particular some gender and gender identity issues that our students had brought forward to us. So I think that piece, but then some of these other pieces mentioned, it would be good to go back and crosswalk those still. So.
Thank you, Kinsey.
And I would just like to add that as a point of emphasis, that vertical alignment from executive limitations through board policy, through administrative regulation is what we're trying to align here with some of this work. And so it's going to take some time, and it's definitely going to take some iterative kinds of back and forth. And we're glad for the opportunity to get that feedback as we start tackling some of those more difficult ones. And so we appreciate the opportunity to present those to you, and they will be back in front of you, and we'll continue this process as long as it takes. Our goal isn't necessarily shove them through. Our goal is to get good quality feedback, both from you all and from our community. And so we'll just continue bringing it back.
Great. And Shamiko and Carrie, did you have anything to add? And it's fine if you don't. Great. All right, then we will move into the superintendent's report. Item number 4. And I'll hand it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Melissa. If you recall, we have a conditional approval right now for our operational plan, which we will be submitting to ODE once we're finalized with that. And our next step that I think we want to bring to your attention today are the areas of concern that we wanted to get into greater detail from last meeting back in August. There were some concerns about how we were going to handle grouping students or cohorting, and then how do we handle lunches in very specific ways when we're feeding, actually I shouldn't say just lunches, let's say meals, as we are feeding students in regards to the need for removing their masks during the feeding experience, whatever that might look like. And so we've brought back some guidelines, and the approach that we're going to take with this is establishing them as expectations and outcomes for each school to be kind of governed by, so that the administrators can build the processes to live by those expectations that I mentioned earlier today. That was one of the last little pieces, some clarification of the language that we added earlier today to make sure that it was clear what those expectations are and how we're to be administering those. But I think before we dive right into that, one of the things that I think would be contextually important is to have our Assistant Director of Health Services give us a little bit of the lay of the land right now with how things are going, both number one, I think in the community and what transmission rates look like right now with regards to COVID-19, and then how we're doing in summer school with regards to transmission of, or even for that matter, any other parts of the district in which we've got personnel working. And so I'd like to ask Tammy Pike to jump in right now and share with you kind of that lay of the land, and then we'll bring it back to discussion about lunches.
Thanks, Dr. Cook. I would like to share my screen. Good thing I had Julianne. Julianne, can you pop it up?
You got it. Here it comes.
Okay.
All right, it's loading for you if you want to get started. I'll
Awesome.
be
Thank
happy
you.
to share for you.
Thanks, everybody. So I just wanted to give you some perspective statewide and locally where we're at pediatric COVID cases. So this is a slide from the OHA PEDS COVID dashboard. And it's just showing you, how we are exploding with cases, it feels like, from 8/1/21. That's the latest I could get. Confirmed cases, I'm going by the numbers that are recent. So we've got close to 1,500-ish around there. And you can see just, the trends, how it's just shot up over the past few months. So that's a snapshot for that. Next one, Julianne.
Did I kick myself out? Let me grab that for you again, Tammy.
Thanks. And then we'll go to the next slide. There you go. Perfect. Okay, now we want to hone in on Deschutes County. So we're going to go by case counts by week. As you can see, from 8/8 to 8/14, 920 cases in Deschutes County that we know of. I've interacted with, a few people that are, they're indicating, oh, my family member tested positive and I'm sick too, so I have it, and they don't want to get tested. So this is just the known cases. Next one, Julianne. Cool. And then we're going to go through hospitalizations. Just wanted to show you the trend on that. As you can see, 8/1, we're now well into August, but it's just showing you the trend that's going up. And again, this is data as of 8/17 from St. Charles Health System. Next slide, Julianne. And then we've got case rate by age. This is for Deschutes County. As you can see, for the 18 to 19-year-olds, about 75 cases per 100,000. And then the 20 to 29-year-old area is over 75 cases per 100,000. That's for the dates 8/15 to 8/21. And then last slide. And then I just wanted to point out, because it seems like this Delta variant is the predominant variant that we're dealing with. And the Delta variant is more contagious than previous strains. It may cause more than 2 times as many infections. Vaccine, mask, social distancing. So I just wanted to kind of give everybody a little visual of, like, there's the original COVID strain. One person infects 2 people. Now you've got the Delta variant, and you can see how many more people, how much more contagious it is. So just to kind of give you an example. Thanks, Julianne. I also wanted to talk about our cases for summer school. And so I have a few numbers for you. So one of our schools, Buckingham, we had a total of 4 confirmed cases from students during the time from, I'm going to say 7/29, because that's when staff started coming back in, through the end of last Thursday. We had 4 students confirmed. I've got another one that's unverified. And we had 1 staff that tested positive before school started. And then we have 1 staff that was that is unverified at this time. We also have involved with that is transportation, and we had 2 staff test positive. 1 is directly associated with this situation at Buckingham. The other one we've determined is not. And then the other school, Lava Ridge, we had 2 cases, and 1 for a student, and then another was sent notification that there was COVID, and they went and tested, and they tested positive. So we do have sports. We've got football. We had 3 cases for Ben High football, and we had 3 cases at Mountain View High School. And just with this has definitely been a learning situation for me, and I think this is going to make us better. Is that initially we had quarantined both teams for 10 days for the unvaccinated students, and just digging further in and asking more detailed questions, we were able to bring back most of the kids back to practice. So that was a positive there. And then I've got one-offs for, like, I had an Elk Meadow, I had a High Desert, we had Lapine and Roslyn. Bear Creek was a staff member, and they didn't have summer school, but it was, they were on site. Ponderosa 1, Silver Rail 1. We did have some custodial staff, 3 of those at different schools. And at maintenance, we had 1. So that's just to kind of give you a little bit of rundown. But for the Buckingham, when we started seeing, when we got our first or second, I think it's our first case, and then another case tested positive on the bus, that in consultation with the health department and also with students, the bus driver had to continuously remind students to keep their masks on, to pull them up. And so we felt it was safest to quarantine the whole bus. And we did get another student test positive that was on the bus. So good thing we did quarantine. That's pretty much it for my report. But I will take questions.
So I just want to be really clear when you're talking about cases and when you're talking about spread. So you believe that the 4 cases at Buckingham and perhaps the sports teams, that there was actual spread in the school potentially, as opposed to the other isolated cases?
So good question, Carrie. I believe the Buckingham, yes, was a school spread. Of course, we can never be 100% sure, right? But, since the numerous cases, my feeling is with the football is that it was close contact outside of football itself. These guys are really doing a great job. And even after this, they are just really tightening down. And these athletes, they want to play. So they're going to abide by the rules and mask up. I think for Mountain View, I think they're all, in Ben High, they're all doing the best they can with masking, and they were great. As soon as I called them, the coaches knew exactly they were masked. This is what we did. And then just interviewing families of the positive cases, finding out a little bit, digging in a little bit more about there were activities outside of football practice that could have contributed to that.
Thank you.
Amy.
So Tammy, would you say then those 4 cases at Buckingham were in school spread? You think there were 4 cases that occurred because of spread within our elementary school?
I feel confident that they are. Of course, I can't say 100% sure, but I feel confident that they were.
Okay. And from your research, do you think that an adult was the vector to the students?
I could
You
not
don't know.
tell you that.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Are we having issues with adult staff coming to work sick?
A little bit, yes. I do have to say, our staff, for the most part, they have been amazing. But it's, you know, we've had cases recently, yes, where staff have come to work sick, you know, and of course we think it's the smoke, or we think it's just our allergies, and then they go get tested and they test positive.
Yeah, and that's a really important piece for people to know, that when you're vaccinated, the virus can replicate in the upper airway. So I don't know, I think maybe we need to message better to our staff. If you think you have just allergies or you think it's smoke, it needs to be COVID until proven otherwise. Are we having any system for attestation or testing for staff who has symptoms, so that there's some accountability for coming to work sick, since we all know we're not supposed to do that right now?
Well, we did have daily check-in and check-out last year. You know, we were hoping that we could, you know, not do away with it, but, you know, hoping that staff would understand and and realize the importance of not coming to work sick. So at this time, we are hopeful that staff don't come to work sick, but as far as an actual attestation that's like in written form anywhere, no, we don't.
Okay, but we had them do that last year.
Yes.
So I feel like that's a really important point that we need to be having further conversations on, because we're actually, and you know, the case counts you just showed us, we are at our most dangerous time in the pandemic. So we should not, as a district, be doing away with any of the safety measures that were in place last year. If anything, we need to be making them tighter. And so if we're not attesting, who made that decision and why? And can we put it back in place ASAP in order to try to keep our schools open and safe? So I'm looking at administrators to talk about that piece of it.
I think I can take that one on. I think the set of guidelines coming from ODE last year, there was 123 restrictions that were expected to be addressed in deliverables. And this year there's 4 restrictions from ODE. And so part of what we're trying to do is start to live in that next stage of what does it look like to live with it for the next several years. How are we going to navigate that, and what is the most reasonable path forward? And so that's where I would tell you that some of this stuff is probably in between those 2 positions, between 123 restrictions and 4.
So Dr. Cook, one of the things you have said at past meetings is we will tighten up as circumstances dictate the need to tighten up. And with us currently having the highest caseloads we've ever had in Deschutes County, why would we not be following the tightest possible of protocols? Why would right now be a time when we loosened it just because ODE says we can?
I think generally that comes from the position of the adults that can be vaccinated, that have chosen to be vaccinated, creates a different dynamic. And when we talk about how we're going to tighten restrictions and how we're going to deal with schools, it's not necessarily as the entire system, but as schools in which we're having issues. And so, for example, if Buckingham were facing these issues and other schools across the district weren't, like if we were all in school right now, then we would target, all right, what are some more mitigation strategies we could do at the elementary school? Because if we're going to start putting in issues because we speculate that adults are the point of transmission for students, then we are going to have to put in a lot more restrictions, not just a couple of them. And a self-attestation is going to be just one of many that we would have to do, because right now we don't know where those cases originated from. And that would be the challenge. So I think that's the difference in how we're approaching right now. And I agree, this is right now, the case counts have never been higher in Deschutes County. And I think we're seeing that pockets of that nationally, but we're also trying to figure out how we're going to manage to do our best to keep kids in school and refocus back on teaching and learning. So I appreciate the feedback.
I'm gonna have to back up Amy on this because that is the goal, to keep kids in school. And last year we were able to do it successfully with the layered precautions that we have in place. And it feels like going into this year, we peeled a lot of those back, and we keep being told as signs show, then we'll add them back. And I don't see them getting added back. When does that happen? It feels like the time is now, and we should have those in place. And then, as the numbers, then we can peel them back. Because you're right, at some point we do have to peel them back, and it just feels very odd that we're going into the school year kind of with this. Well, let's just see how these kids fare, and I'm not comfortable with that.
So I just want to clarify, my understanding that the conditional approval on the operational plan, which was approved last month, with the exception of just lunches and cohorts, is now being requested to be revised and changed and rebuilt. Is that what I'm hearing?
I guess my point is, you said you would tighten as circumstances warranted. The circumstances warrant it. No one working in healthcare right now is going to tell you that it does not warrant tightening of protocols. So even if we approved a conditional plan, it is on you to be tightening those protocols. And so I guess what I'm asking for is your thought process on when you tighten that. And if not now, why not now?
And in conjunction with that as well, looking at the Delta variant is a lot more contagious, if that's what we're saying. And I don't want to know if I'm using the right term in that regard. And more people can get infected with that. And we've noticed just in a small sample size of summer school, and people are already being infected. What is that going to do when you have a larger population of people coming in? And I understand Amy and Shamiko's concern in that. Guess what? If we have the ability to tighten and still get back into school, let's tighten, right? Is what I'm hearing. And that being said, also, guess what? If students are in school, it seems like from a social standpoint, they do a lot better when they know what the rules are. And then also in knowing how to abide by those rules, give them the ability to be able to do things within the classroom, out in the playground, in the lunchroom, or wherever they reside within the schools. So that's what I'm hearing. And that's what I'm thinking as well. It's like, so if you all have noticed, as soon as the football teams realized that, guess what, they figured out who it was, they tightened, they did what they needed to do, and they're still trying to provide a season for these students. So I see exactly where they're coming from.
Love to step in on two fronts. One, I think that there's two different pieces here. One is what our protocols are for our schools and our children, and then there is a separate conversation I'm hearing around adults and what we're expecting of adults in our buildings. And so what I'm hearing in terms of, a testing, et cetera, in terms of, what our adults in our buildings are expected to do, I think is different and is an add-on, Steve, to what we have previously approved. And so I want to separate that. And then I feel like the pieces around kids, we've heard a lot of different feedback on, and also want to recognize that we have not heard from Carrie, Shirley, or Yannette on this. And so I'd like to invite them into the conversation.
I mean, my preference is to use strategies that have been shown to work. So I would love to know, like, just to take each one, for example, the testing, is that something that the hospitals are using right now? Has that shown to work? I think it is a problem right now. Anecdotally, I too have heard many people who, were a little sick, thought it was something else, and have been positive. And so in that particular example, if that is a strategy that works, it's fairly non-invasive, and it is a problem, it seems like something that we should consider tightening up. I just would always prefer to go back to our public health officials or medical professionals to find out what they think best practices are, so that we're using the most informed best practices possible.
Well, I think that although it seems like much longer, a lot has changed in the short amount of time when we gave the conditional approval. And so I think that it is worth our time to just sort of revisit these key points. And Melissa, thank you for making that distinction that we're talking about, a different guideline for students, versus, staff in the schools. And so I think it is worth our time to just pause a little bit and see if there is a way that we can reintroduce something like, that was done earlier this spring, and knowing that the results, were good, using those strategies. I think that if we proceed as if nothing has changed in the last few weeks, with the conditional approval, I think it's too much to risk. I don't want that responsibility. I don't think any of my fellow board members want that responsibility either. And so I think it is important for us to just sort of, again, pause and let's reevaluate these 2 points, as Melissa kind of lined them out for us.
The other conversation we haven't had this year, and I'm not sure if it's changed, is around incentives and policies. Do they support and encourage staff to call in sick when they're sick? So is it easy to get tested? Is it easy to get a substitute? Do they have the sick time available? Is there a sick time bank? If it's COVID related, all those sorts of questions around how are staff incentivized and supported not to come to school, and same with students, how are students incentivized and supported not to come to school when they're feeling even a tiny bit sick.
Thank you. Shirley, did you want to add to this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Melissa. I do believe that we might need now, with the new requirements, to separate staff practice from student practice. I think that's a reasonable request, Steve. Again, we know everything changes, every week. So it's very hard to talk about administrative regs when the rules keep changing. But I do think that staff needs to be really clear about expectations, and the fact that testing is no longer an out, if you will, but it still could be provided if people need it. And I see that as a tightening also. So I would support separating some of the areas of that conditional policy for staff and for students, and just being really clear about that. I think our building administrators are going to be faced with this daily. So if we can help be as clear as possible, I think we will support them.
Melissa, may I chime in? Thanks. Hey, thanks you guys. Good conversation. I just want to remind folks that we do have these signs that are on every facility that remind folks that if they're sick, students or staff that are sick need to stay home. So I think what I'm hearing here is a double down on that. And we have been really consistent in communicating, thanks to Tammy Pike, who's constantly telling us, push out again, that staff need to stay home. I am digging right now into the OSHA guidance to see what kind of guidance we have there. I just took a look. There's nothing explicit in the RSSL. So I would propose, if you guys wouldn't mind, if you want to leave the plan intact so that our families have that to look forward to, we could commit to getting something to you around a really big double down for our staff.
Thanks, Julianne. I would say, I think what I would suggest is that we allow Steve and our team to present the actual plan. And then that we come back to that after the plan and decide on multiple pieces where we stand in terms of approval. Does that sound okay, Steve?
So I want to make sure I understand that the conditional plan is still approved. But we're wanting to see a little more explicit direction on staff practices. And I think the one guidance I've heard so far is make sure we're communicating more effectively on those staff expectations and potentially reinstating a self-attestation for staff when they come in as a directed mandate. And then I didn't hear any other specifics of expectations on as a requirement for staff. I just want to make sure, was there something else I missed?
I want to go back to something that Carrie mentioned, and it was how we make these decisions. So much decision-making has been placed in local control, and I feel like none of us here, except Amy and Tammy, are remotely qualified to make decisions on how we improve health outcomes and keep our kids safe during a pandemic. So I also feel very strongly that any decision of, gosh, should we test in this case? Or there was an outbreak in this school. Where were the holes in our, our layered precautions, and what additional things can we add that either public health or we partner with our local medical professionals to lend their input. I know Tammy is incredibly busy, so to throw her onto this task is not something that I want to go toward. But is there someone else like Tammy's, a community partner that we can tap into so that every decision that we're making is backed by best practice from the medical community or the public health community, so that we're not the ones making that decision?
And not just the medical community, but specifically people with expertise in epidemiology and, pandemics. And
yeah,
So-
that was one of the things that worked really well last year, Dr. Cook, is that we had a medical advisory committee, and that is not in place yet this year. But I think that is something the board should ask for, that we have a regular group of medical professionals, and there are many in the community who are eager to volunteer their time because they are parents and they understand how important this is. But that when I hear that a group of school administrators who do not have a healthcare background are making decisions about the health and well-being of our children, I am not okay with that. That's a full stop, hard stop. That would be the same as me sitting in a room making decisions about the intricacies of designing curriculum. That is not my area of expertise. I would never claim to be an expert in that area. And as we talk about opening schools, we cannot do that with educational leaders being the drivers. You have to do it in consult with medical professionals and with the experts in this, particular area.
Amy, I think to your point, that is something that we have been doing. Tammy has been reaching out more less formally to the medical professionals. And then of course we're using partners at OHA, local health authority. So this is certainly not something that any of us want to do in a vacuum. So we are committed to continuing those conversations with our partners. And I would say having some medical professionals that are part of a more formalized team, and that they could actually schedule some time instead of us calling them all the time. That might be better for everyone, so that we're not constantly like, hey, we have a question about this, we have a question about that. So I think that's another thing we can take back. I think we're doing it informally, and there's opportunity here now that we're all getting ramped back up to do it more formally.
And I just want to say last year, yes, that committee, it helped take a lot of the stress off of the pressure-ish. Laura probably would disagree, but the pressure a little bit is that this was some of our decisions are made in collaboration with experts. And so, taking it out there, it kind of had more, I don't want to say validity to it. It's like, okay, best practice. This is what we did. We've had these, healthcare professionals involved. And I would say it helped me tremendously because the pressure of trying to make decisions, because you're going to make somebody mad somewhere. And so having a group talk through it and just make decisions was very beneficial last year, for sure.
So I don't think we would be opposed at all in having a medical advisory committee that would help support the decision-making of Tammy. And as we work through with, one thing I would say is that we've not made any decisions since I've been here without being lockstep with public health. Every single one of these things that if we had concerns, we were reaching out and doing that. So I think, I don't know that I would say that we're just throwing this on principles and seeing if it sticks and then saying, well, what do you think, you guys? What do you want us to do? I think the guidance is that this is going to be a moving target, and it's going to be different in different schools because of the way that this is going to play out. And so there's going to have to be some decisions that are made where we might have to do something different at one school than we do at another. And while we're not experts in the medical field, we are expected to provide safe school environments for 32 schools. And so I think that's part of what we can bring to the table. And we're not at all opposed of having medical expertise giving us input in those decisions, not at all.
But we didn't bring them in for the lunch plan.
Shamiko, I can address that.
So hold on, Julianne, let me go there. So here's specifically the lunch plan, just quite specifically, we met every expectation from ODE, and which was that students, if and when students are unmasked, elementary students specifically, first of all, they're going to eat outside. Secondly, if it's inclement weather, we'd bring them in, and then we would spread them out indoors, either in classrooms or in cafeteria spaces based upon wherever we could get those spaces available. And that those students would be at least 6 feet apart during those lunch times. And that's the guidance that is understood and accepted nationally, that if we're meeting that standard, we're meeting the standard.
So you said that all of your decisions have been made in conjunction with public health. This lunch plan, did you run this by our local public health authority?
We did, yeah. We got feedback on the fact that if we're feeding kids indoors and they're 6 feet apart, is that acceptable? And they supported that completely.
Okay, so there's a few things in this plan that are problematic to me. And it's largely because the language is somewhat open to interpretation. So when it says, outside as weather permits, there may be an administrator who thinks 50 degrees is too cold, so the kids are going to be inside. And there may be another administrator who's like, no, they're outside until it's 30 degrees. And, we did receive letters from healthcare professionals that were signed by experts with specific guidance. And this plan leaves way too much open to individual interpretation. And as I told you, I had a conversation with a school administrator that made me very uncomfortable about sending my child back, because it was very clear that that administrator did not take the precautions that they probably should and were dismissive of my concerns as a parent with a medically vulnerable family. And so I can't approve a plan that does not have very specific parameters, so that there is not any sort of open to interpretation based on how seriously someone takes COVID. The other piece of this is, and this is all pertinent to the elementary school, because at the middle and high school, students have agency and they don't have to stay with their classroom. But at the elementary level, students don't have agency. They are forced to stay with their classroom. Therefore, if a student's fine eating outside, they don't have that option if their classroom teacher wants them to eat indoors. 6 feet to the extent possible. So what if there's an administrator who says, it's too hard, we're going to put them all in there 3 feet apart, all in the cafeteria, all at the same time? This plan allows that sort of deviation and variation, and that makes me extremely uncomfortable. I want clear documentation. If I were designing a policy for St. Charles, that's not a policy that would ever get approved. It's not detailed. It doesn't give specific parameters, and I need those specifics in a plan that is being brought to us for approval.
Okay. Amy, Steve did send some updated language on that in terms of correcting.
I'm looking at it right now, Melissa. It's still not specific. It still says as weather permits, which is a huge red flag. To the extent possible, like those are, I'm looking in the appendix A. And the language in the other document is even more vague.
But I see 6 feet of social distancing will be maintained when meals are eaten in indoor designated areas at K-8 schools.
Yeah, the updated documentation that we sent out later today, and I've got Skip is available for us if we want to ask specific questions. That was written as outcome expectations, and it was written to the extent, and it was, you're right, Amy, it was written in a way that could be applied over all of our elementary schools that have different conditions and different square footage and different sets of classroom. The number of students in each classroom would vary, so that there's lots of those challenges that you could adapt to. And so we wrote that language as an outcome. Therefore, students at the elementary school would be socially distanced outside as weather permits. We have some guidance that we use for most things that come from them. 20 degrees is the cutoff. And then there's specific guidance that we use for like practices and things like that, that when, for example, smoke is bad, that will bring our students inside. And that we didn't put those parameters in there because we wanted to also afford the principals that if they needed to respond and bring kids in, they could. But we also maintain that the expectation is when they go indoors, they will still be maintaining 6 feet of distance. And that was in that updated document today. So I'd like to have Skip, if you could jump in at this point and talk a little bit about those discussions you've been having at the elementary level. I think it'd be truly helpful.
Can other people hear Skip?
Skip, we don't have your sound.
No.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, my headset wasn't working. So thank you very much. So we've met with all of our principals. We met with them yesterday, and then we met with them today via WebEx. Sitting down today after we got some clarity from Dr. Cook on the expectations, we met with them all today and let them know that the expectation is that all students will be eating outside, and they will be maintaining 6 feet apart. We took out the language to the extent possible, and we said we want to ensure that all students are 6 feet apart when they are outside. The language around when weather permits, we follow the guidelines that are sent to us around air quality. So thankfully our air is very nice right now, but we know that can change. And when we get an email saying the air quality is such that we need to be inside, then we will follow that recommendation. The principals brought up the temperature guidelines. 20 degrees has been our temperature that we've used for going outside for recess. But eating outside continually, we haven't had any temperature around that. So all of them agreed that we need to meet and decide what is the temperature that we will use for not eating outside. 20 degrees going outside and moving around is just a little bit different than 20 degrees standing or sitting and eating lunch. So I don't know what that is, but we would have a set guideline that would be consistently followed. So one school wasn't bringing kids in and another school wasn't. And then of course with rain, I think we all know that it can be raining at one school and not be raining at another. So we will have to have principals make a judgment on that, whether the students would be able to go outside to eat if it was wet or not. When they do come inside to eat, we made it perfectly clear that they need to have assigned locations for those students, that they are eating in an assigned location, and it needs to be 6 feet apart. Since we don't have classes completely formed and we are still doing staffing, we don't know the size, the enrollment of some of our classes. So once we get that, we will be able to determine whether being in a classroom is possible for some of our bigger classes. When that is not possible, then the principals will designate a spot for that class, which will accommodate their kids. But Tammy and I both made it very, very clear that just using the cafeteria and having assigned seats in the cafeteria for large groups of students is not acceptable, that we expect that lunches will be eaten in the classroom with accommodations made for those large classes where they would not be able to stay 6 feet apart.
So Skip, I appreciate that update, and that is exactly the type of detail that I'm looking in a plan that we are being asked to approve. And the plan that is before us does not have those details in it. So until we have a plan with those details, this is not something I personally am comfortable voting any sort of approval on. I want those details, and I appreciate that you're working through those details, because that is what is needed. And everything you just said is reasonable, but we don't have it as a written document. The same way that we were given a dress code with, that was a page and a half long with very explicit parameters. We don't have that for the lunch plan right now. And I'm not okay with that.
And then to piggyback off what Amy's saying, basically, I think we feel a lot better is what she's ultimately saying is you put that in writing, then guess what? We feel a lot more comfortable is bottom line what it is. Put that same thing you just said in writing, and I think more people will feel more comfortable with going, okay, I see where we're at. But here's the other piece of that too. How are we going to make sure that we're holding the administrators accountable for actually doing that as well, right? Because like you said, you may get an administrator says, you know what, I feel differently about this. I'm not going to do these things. What do we have in place to make sure that we take care of that as well?
Yeah, I think Marcus, that's my job, and then that's Steve's job. Steve holds me accountable. I hold the principals accountable, and delivering the message and delivering the expectations for lunches.
And
I
so, can I,
Shirley?
There's all of us are talking at once. Okay, Shirley, you go first. Or Steve.
All righty. Since we had a chance to meet with the South County administrators the other day, I'm just going to say that it's very possible that it's 20 degrees in Bend, and it's much less than that down up in La Pine. So that can be different. There will be different calls on the school, even with very specific guidelines. And the principals know that, and they will be held accountable, I'm sure, not just by us, not by Skip, not by Steve, but by parents. So again, it's a communication issue. Whatever we finally approve, it's a communication issue to make sure that parents understand, and they will help hold the buildings accountable for those kinds of decisions. So I'm comfortable with having a little more detail, but I do have respect for our administrators, and I don't think anybody's going to make a decision outside of what, not in this case. It's too important. It's too high profile. I think everybody will be very careful.
and I would, if I could, just advocate as strongly as I can and plea with you that those 4 statements that we added today, those are written as outcomes, and that is the level of expectation that people would be held accountable to. And so then it's their responsibility. And this is the way we would deliver just about anything. And that expectation is, what do you have to do to meet those expectations? That's a decision made by the leader, because they know their building, they know how best to deliver upon that. And that's why it gives them that opportunity to do so in knowing what their circumstances are, but we hold them accountable to those expectations. So this, to me, actually makes a lot more sense by giving them those outcomes and saying, make this work, spread your kids out if they're indoors, at least 6 feet apart. I'm not going to dictate line by line how that's delivered, nor am I going to expect that every school does it exactly the same way. But what we are going to expect is that those outcomes are always in place, because those are the outcomes that we know will keep kids safest.
So last year, one of the things that was important that isn't there this year, which we talked about at the last meeting, was cohorting, which, you know, transferred into what lunchtime looks like. So every classroom was eating together. So when you were unmasked, you knew that you were unmasked with the same X number of kids every day. So I think something that Skip talked about that's definitely not in the plan, that's not spelled out in those outcomes, is how many kids are in your group, because it says designated areas, which is fine. I know that every school needs to determine what those designated areas per group, but what that doesn't spell out is who's in your group. Is it half the school? Is it just your class? Is it the entire grade level? How many kids are in there? And I know that changes depending on the size of the space that that exists, but you could fit a lot of kids 6 feet apart in a gym. And if you cram out that gym that way, like, no, I don't think having that many kids in a space unmasked talking to each other for, you know, 20, 30 minutes is a safe plan. But what Skip talked about is that they're going to be cohorted during lunch. Not cohort's not the right word. They're going to be eating lunch separately within their classrooms. And if that can be spelled out, I think that would, that needs to be like defined. So, and then what happens where they are in the building, like that, yeah, school level, figure that out. But the number of kids per group and who they're interacting with unmasked is I think a big hole in this current plan.
And I would remind us that, Shamiko, that when these kids go outside, they're not going to be, in our current plan, they are not going to be limited in who they have contact with. And currently right now, there's not required masking when they go outside. And so that's one of the reasons that OHA and ODE have backed off of the required cohorting kind of tightness that we had last year, was that they're going to be intermingling and mixing when they go outside. And so if I think the difference is right now, if we said, okay, we're going to eat in the gym and we can make sure that every kid's at least 6 feet apart, that while they take their masks off, that's the part of the guidelines that they would say you're meeting those expectations. Because once they go outside, that cohorting doesn't exist anyways, and they're unmasked outside.
Indoor and outdoor rules are totally separate as far as ventilation and airflow. If it needs to be defined who my kid is interacting with. If they're going to be unmasked in a room with 100 other kids, I'm not comfortable with any student being in that scenario. And I think the amount of spread we're going to see within our schools is going to be pretty high. And I just, if it's possible to have them in their classroom in just with their class, and we can do that. Can we define that just so that we can eliminate that hole in the plan?
I think that's what we're telling you, is that we would intend to use that to the extent that it is possible for every single classroom.
Not to the extent they will.
No, not the spacing to the extent, but not every class is going to be able to have every student in. That's what Skip was talking about, was that some of those classes are larger and those classes might need to be spread out in more places, which includes things like overflow into a cafeteria or other locations.
I don't think I'm wording this right. Does someone else want to?
Yeah.
I think my brain is maxing out a little bit right now. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we cannot compare indoor and outdoor locations. That is not fair. Indoor, we know, are high risk, and indoor unmasked is the highest risk activity we can currently engage in. So, you know, take the outdoor off the table. I'm a lot less concerned with what they do outside as what happens indoors. And so when you're talking indoors, yeah, if you put in 4 classes, they're 6 feet apart in a cafeteria and they're all eating together and there's no time parameters. There's no rules of behavior. You know, we had said last year, and I know it sounds draconian, like kids can't eat while they're talk while they're eating, but that is for public safety, so we can get them outside so they can talk and play, right? Those things are not spelled out in this plan, and those were very clear in the plan last year, that kids would remove their masks for 15 minutes indoors with their stable cohort. None of that is in this plan. And if an administrator is like, oh, the kids are all eating at 12 today, so we're going to put in, 2 grade levels in the cafeteria because we can set them 6 feet apart. But this is an airborne virus. So if we then have spread in 4 classrooms because we have too many kids in that space, we're closing an entire school down. That is what the public health department would tell us to do if we had an outbreak in multiple classrooms, I believe. And what does that do? That disrupts education and learning. And our goal is to get kids in full time with minimal disruption. And our lunch plan has to be tight. There is no room for looseness. There's no room for kind of personal opinions. I want a tight lunch plan. This has to be tight in order to keep our schools open and safe and reduce community transmission and spread in our schools. And we've seen this summer, Delta is different. If we have 4 cases potentially that originated from in-school spread at Buckingham, when we have 10%, I'm just saying 10%, I'm not sure what percentage of our elementary kids are actually back in the buildings. But last year we were able to say with all of our mitigation measures that we had maybe 3 cases of in-school transmission. And at one school in 2 weeks of instruction, we've had 4, and we're talking about looser lunch plans. That is not okay in any conceivable way to me as a medical professional, as a mother. And I think a lot of the parents in our community want those details because lunch is the sticking point for a lot of us.
Skip, is there any other things that you guys talked about that you want to share?
Some of the things we talked about, we were very, very clear that large lunch groups were not going to take place in the cafeteria. So I'll just give an example. Silver Rail has, believe it or not, one of our newest schools has some of the smallest classrooms. So when you put 5th graders upstairs in a classroom and maybe you've got 31 5th graders in there because that's the target class size, then when you're trying to space them 6 feet apart with masks off eating, that might not work. So we need to figure out a plan for those 5th graders so they can separate. So we look at the alternatives there, and that's where we get to this. Different schools just have different layouts. So having that ability to tailor it for your school under a specific guidelines, I think is very important. So taking those kids and moving them out into maybe some of the common areas outside the classroom might work. But if you've got 3 or 4 5th grade classes that are having to spread out, maybe that doesn't work because then those classes are getting too close together. So then we may want to look at an alternative setting down in the cafeteria for a select group of kids. But keeping in mind all of those guidelines of keeping 6 feet apart and keeping masks off for limited amounts of time when they're inside. It gets tricky. The prototypical schools like the High Lakes, the Ponderosas, that pretty much all look the same. Those are plans that will look very, very similar, I think. And one thing we did that Tammy and I did mention to the principals is after we do get approval of our guidelines and what we need to follow once we get this process done, is we may have them put it on their website what it looks like for each grade level once they get their class sizes all set and see what can and cannot be done. And then also putting that in the newsletters so parents know this is how lunches will take place for their school and for their particular grade level and their particular class.
It's Skip, really quick, a quick question.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Quick question, because if I actually visit some of the schools as well. and a lot of the conversation from different people at different locations, the thing they wanted to know about outdoor assemblies. You know, that was one of the things that came up was outdoor assemblies. Can they do that, say, with one classroom or a couple classrooms outdoor assembly, be able to space out and do that? Other things came up was talking about safe route, but also having new roundabouts and students being able to transition. Do we have the ability to be able to have those trainings in an assembly setting or classroom by classroom from a volunteer if they're tested, right? Or one of the other things I think they brought up as well was volunteers, because we know we have a limit. Volunteers was basically a major concern for a lot of our schools because volunteers are very valuable with helping with reading and other things that we need within the schools. What do we have, or what have we talked about in terms of looking at those things or adding these to the guidelines as a possibility?
So volunteers right now, we have let all the principals know that we're following our guidelines from last year, that unfortunately volunteers are off the table right now, unless they are essential volunteers, and that falls, Marcus, under the group that we identified last year. We have a OSU Cascades nutrition group. We have our Camp Tamarack people that come in. We have very, very limited volunteers that are coming into our school. So and then once, you know, as things change, we will revisit that decision. About groups, I think things have changed as of today with the governor's announcement around groups. We need to revisit bringing groups of people onto our school. I know schools we're exploring different plans of maybe bringing parents out onto the playground and spacing them apart to just do some sort of introductory session, especially for our kindergarten families who are bringing their children to school sometime for the first time they've ever come to our school. We thought it would be important, and if we could stay within the guidelines and keep that congregation outside and spread apart, we thought we could do that. However, the governor, you know, announced things today that I think we're going to have to read and quite possibly change our mind on. I just haven't taken the time to look at it. So I think tightening that down, and unfortunately, you know, reacting and moving things back just to react to changing times. And since, you know, from last week to now, things have changed, and we need to change our thinking along with that.
So if I may, I wonder if there's a possible, I don't know if it's a compromise, but I think I still feel like we can meet those expectations that are being communicated from the board right now. I think the first thing is I still want us to commit to those outcomes and those expectations that are written in the supplemental document this afternoon. I think the second thing I would ask is that we would like, if we could get the board's approval, we would then also make sure that we built some kind of medical committee, medical expert committee that would review every single school's lunch plan so that it's not in the hands of just administrators, but we've got medical experts going through and determining that the nuance of each plan for each of our elementary schools does meet expectations for the best practice for how we would administer kids being split apart, separated 6 feet apart or more, as they were eating lunch. I think that stands great in those outcomes and those expectations, but having somebody actually look over the plan or potentially walking into a school to review, how do you put people in the room? Where are you putting them? What are you doing with overflow? I think to some extent that's going to need to be adjusted as classes are formed, because we don't know where those big classes are, with some commitments to consistency that we're not going to maximize putting kids in the gym as indoor. We do know that indoor transmission is a challenge with this Delta variant. Those are the kinds of commitments I think that we would be glad to make, as we want to seek to get our kids in safe environments as well. But I think we also want to recognize that it's not just our job to be the medical experts, but it is our job to do those things that we can with their expertise, giving us that feedback in real time. And as we learn more, we do better. How does that go?
I'm still concerned about the wording around the grouping. I totally hear that you're saying we're going to try hard not to put them in the where, you know, we've told them they can't do that, but it's I want to see it in writing somehow so that when it can't happen and they have to be creative and resourceful and they're going to have to come up with a plan that's pretty tough to come up with. If they fall back on, well, it's not really in the plan, so it's fine. I need to see it in there because that is what it's going to come down to, and that is what we're approving. So unless it's written in there, I'm not comfortable approving it. And my 3-year-old is saying hi.
Yeah.
So,
I was
okay.
gonna say most.
I'm gonna
is what I
insert
wanna see
myself
in
because
writing.
as facilitator, I haven't been, but I'm actually very comfortable with this. I am actually very comfortable with the outcomes and just want to put that forward. I feel like the stance of putting forward outcomes that every building administrator then has to adhere to and design a plan to make sure that they implement is the right way. And it's what we do with our superintendent. We say, here are the outcomes, here are executive limitations, and you have to figure out your plan to be able to do that. And so I'm actually in favor of the plan that's set forward with the additional language in terms of setting those expectations and allowing that. So I just want to, I'm sorry to insert myself, but I feel like I'm caught in the facilitation and speaking piece, and I just want to add that. But Amy, go ahead.
When we approved the other plan, was it outcome based or was it detailed based? Because if we approved the other plan and it was not outcome based, why would we approve this as an outcome based procedure?
I would say that the outcome piece is adding that detail personally, that we had a plan and that this is the thing that we are going to hold every building principal accountable for. And again, to echo what Skip and Steve said, they are going to then hold every building principal accountable, which is their job, to meeting these outcomes, to making sure that we have the 6 feet of spacing, that it's outdoors, et cetera.
But Melissa, we're being asked to approve a plan, not an outcome, correct?
Well, we approved
a plan for last time. This isn't a plan, this is an outcome.
We approve a lot of things along those lines. I would say that we approve board ends along those lines of what we want to see in the direction we want people to go. And then we empower our team to figure out the actions that they need to take to meet the outcome that we want them to achieve. And so I actually think from a governance perspective, the best route for a board is to say, here are the clear outcomes that we want you to achieve. We are empowering you now to figure out how to do that. And then we will hold you accountable for achieving those. So from a governance perspective, I actually think that the outcome-based procedure is correct.
In safety precautions that are political, that are controversial, that not everyone agrees on, I'm not comfortable just saying these are the outcomes, especially when we're not identifying the grouping. I mean, that is a critical missing piece. We're just saying groups. How big are these groups? Unless we identify and really spell out how many kids that each child is coming in contact with unmasked indoors for a significant amount of time, I'm not comfortable approving this.
So we wouldn't be opposed to adding some kind of a grouping outcome, grouping expectation. I think what the challenge is, what's the definition of coming in contact with, right? Because right now that has a lot of different meanings potentially in how it's being expressed. And so I would be curious, Shamiko, to hear a little more about what what specifically you mean on that, because I think there's some flexibility we have there, because I think that we would aspire to do those very things. And I think we would also try to manage that specifically for each school as best we could. I know there's no intention of just throwing people into a room, so I'd like to hear more on what you're talking about there.
I mean, the way it was last year is that when the students were unmasked, they were unmasked only within their classroom. So we knew that when there was an exposure, when they were unmasked, that it happened only within the students that they were exposed to all day long. When you start mixing different classrooms, the exposure and the risk level goes significantly higher. So my fear is if we're only holding ourselves to the standard of 6 feet apart, we can fit a lot of kids together in a lot of our spaces 6 feet apart, and that number is way too high. But I don't want to name a number saying it can't be more than 2 classrooms, because what if we did have a really large space that could fit 3 classrooms and they weren't, but I don't think 3 classrooms 6 feet apart is what I'm talking about. I'm like significantly spaced apart, and I don't want to be the one making this decision. This needs to be a public health, medical background decision.
So
Can I
that's
take
what
a step back and ask Laura or Skip or Julianne to actually speak to that? Because I'm not sure that that actually is what happened last year at all of our schools.
That's correct. That's why I wanted to jump in here, Shamiko, to just clarify about last year. We talked about this just today, as a matter of fact. What we tried to do, obviously was to keep the groups as small as possible. In many of our schools, what we defined as a group was not a single class, but an entire grade level. And that's not just because of lunch, that would be because of intervention groups that met across classes. So that group size could be as large as 3 or 4 classrooms of students. In terms of eating lunch specifically, we could not maintain 6 feet of distance inside in many of our 4th and 5th grade classrooms. So students, whether it was the cafeteria or spilling out, how many of our prototype schools have a large common area. So you might have a 4th grade class here that had 7 or 8 kids out in a commons area, and a 4th grade class across the hall that had 7 and 8 students out in a commons area. So, I don't want to weigh in on this discussion except to say that was in existence last year, because there was no way in our larger classes that we could maintain that 6 feet of distance unmasked with everyone in the classroom. So we had to find alternatives then as well. What I would say, and I think it's important for the board to know, and again, it was something that came up specifically at the elementary level today with Tammy and Skip talking to our team. Our elementary schools did a great job last year. They, in terms of limiting the time that the students were unmasked, keeping them 6 feet apart, minimizing talking during that time. And we really only have one elementary principal who's new to our district who did not work on these things last year. So I feel highly confident, and I think it's great that we have an approval process. I feel highly confident that the plans that they have going forward, that they would bring to an advisory team, will meet the standards that you are referencing here.
And really quick, Laura, my question is this, and maybe this will help clean it up a little bit or clarify it a little bit more. What are the metrics to hold them accountable for the outcomes I think we're ultimately looking at, right? And then number 2, can we use...
Sorry, Marcus, go ahead.
And then can we use density as a better metric than this number of students?
Well, I think we do use density in terms of the 6 feet apart. And I think what Shamiko is addressing is, in addition to the 6 feet apart, obviously in a gym or a cafeteria, you could have a large number of students keeping 6 feet apart. That is not what happened. The few cases where students were in the cafeteria, it was mainly at 4th and 5th grades, because they're our largest classes. And so they were the ones that struggled to have the 6 feet of distance within a classroom. But you might see 2 4th grade classes in a cafeteria at a time, or 2 5th grade classes who had a few students out in the commons area. In Marcus, I would just repeat what Skip said about the accountability. You know, we have lots of people who really care about this. And, you know, it's just like we hold our principals accountable for all kinds of things related to student safety. That, you know, those are Skip and Tammy's job. It's my job. It's Steve's job. You know, I can't answer that any differently than I would say our accountability about making sure a student doesn't get hit by a bus out, you know, if they're leaving school in the afternoon. We have all kinds of safety protocols that we have accountability for as building leaders. You know, that's what we do.
I'm going to call on Carrie because she has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to second Melissa's thoughts around how to move forward with this and our role as a governance board. And I hear and understand all of the concerns, but I actually think the most clear outcome I've heard from the board tonight is the desire for medical experts to review these plans. We have acknowledged that district leadership aren't medical experts, but neither are board members. And so although it's helpful for us to ask questions and, you know, push back and make sure that there's clarity around our expectations, I think I heard Steve say or propose that lunch plans be reviewed by some sort of medical advisory panel. And to me, that sounds like a great solution and what the board is asking for. And I think, frankly, the biggest difference between last year and this year was that every school had to come up with a really specific plan and it had to be reviewed, and we had a medical advisory panel that we talked to regularly. And so I think if the proposal is for schools to write out specific, you know, lunch plans for each of their schools and to have a medical advisory panel review them, that is what the board has asked. And we don't have the expertise to, you know, require any specific protocols any more than anyone else. So I would like to propose that we approve, or that we move on tonight, knowing that the recommendation or the plan is to have each school present a lunch plan and to have it reviewed by some medical professionals. And Janet has also had her hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Janet?
Yeah, thank you for all of the discussions. It's good to hear all the perspectives. Dr. Cook, Dr. Nordquist, thank you for all of your incredible efforts to allow us to be heard and to speak to what we know as parents, you know, is best for our families. But as, again, restating what Carrie and Melissa said, as a governance board, I love the idea of having a medical professional panel, advisory committee, whatever we're going to call it, that actually is determining those specific details. Because I think that we can plan for 1,001 scenarios, and all it takes is somebody like my kiddo sharing a Coke with another kid, a can of Coca-Cola, and then, you know, all of those protocols are sort of out the window. And you know, let's be real. Let's be realistic about what we're expecting out of our students, what we're expecting out of our staff, you know, administrators, everybody that's involved in these really big decisions. And I think that it speaks to us as a board to allow Dr. Cook and Dr. Nordquist for you to trust that your principals and your school administrators are going to be following these guidelines. And we trust you that you're going to be following up with them and ensuring that these measures are being met and that these outcomes are, in fact, you know, what we want, what we're seeing at the school level. So I back what Carrie and Melissa have both stated. I want to move forward with this with approval on it. And I think that we, at least from my perspective, we can leave it up to you to trust you to put these committees together and to ensure that every school is following these protocols in the best way that their space and their staff can support it.
I still would like the details that Skip identified and what Laura identified, what they're talking about, saying that is going to happen. I want that in the plan. I want those details of what that grouping looks like and how many students, when they are unmasked for that amount of time, will be coming into contact with how many other kids. I think that detail is an important detail that needs to go within the outcomes, because if they're going to match the outcomes but we're not listing that detail, that's a gaping hole. I will not approve until that detail is in.
Yeah, I fully agree with Shamiko. And if we're voting to approve it conditional on a medical professional, a team of medical professionals reviewing every plan at the elementary school level, is that really realistically going to happen before school starts? Because that seems like that's the conditional piece that has been added potentially to this, and we don't have that in place. So, I mean, we're welcome to take a vote, but if we're going to take a vote, I want it to be on that condition. And is that operationally feasible by the time school starts to have a detailed plan written out and approved by a medical team that is not yet composed?
So I think what we're going to need to do from an operational standpoint is we're going to need to separate this out into multiple votes. So we are going to need to, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we are going to need to move to full approval of the plan that we conditionally approved before, minus sections. And then we will do a second a vote separately on lunch and separately on cohorting. Does that sound correct, Steve?
I think what you could do is just somebody make a motion for full approval pending the engagement of a medical committee to ensure that compliance with best practices are happening, not just in our lunch plans, but any grouping plans, and that language could be added. And if that receives the requisite votes, then that's what we would then be governed by. The one thing I would ask, and to Amy's point, it's a real question, is that we don't necessarily timestamp that this has to be a completely done by the first day of school, because that's going to put us in a bind that we are going to struggle with. So I do think there's some conditions there that we're going to have to be a little flexible with, but looking to get that team in place pretty quickly.
Can you say your motion
I think
again,
if
please?
it doesn't pass, Melissa, then that's when I think we would take it piece by piece.
Great. Can you state that motion again? Your recommended motion, please.
I think what we would be asking for is to have full approval of our operational plan under the conditions that we appoint or we engage with a medical advisory panel to review lunch and grouping plans. And is it safe to say for just elementary schools right now is the priority? I don't know if I want to add that unless that's what the board is interested in, but I think it would at the very least be prioritized that it's elementary schools.
But we got to look at middle schools too, because there's a lot of middle schoolers who right now are not vaccinated, and it's unfortunate, or they're not age appropriate to be vaccinated, right? So we got to look at those details as well, you know.
So how about we finish with K-8s? Okay.
So the motion that we are seeking is that we move to fully approve the operational plan of Ben Lapine as put forth under the condition that we consult with medical professionals for K-8 lunch protocols and cohorting. Does that sound right?
And future other big decisions in the future. I mean, that's sort of the one on the table right now, but
Yeah, we would seek them to be ongoing for sure.
And ongoing navigation of the pandemic. Okay. I should probably type this into the chat. But
I think you could just say the motion if you wanted to, Melissa.
I'm not supposed to move.
Oh, really?
As the board chair.
Chair's supposed to do the motion, so somebody's going to have to.
I will say it again if anyone has a really good memory, but we are going to move to fully approve the operational plan as put forth under the condition that we consult with medical professionals for the K-8 lunch protocols and cohorting specific and ongoing navigation of the pandemic. Is there someone who would move for that?
I will move to approve the plan as written, full approval of the plan as written, under the condition that we form a medical advisory panel to review the lunch protocols of each individual school and help with ongoing decisions related to the pandemic.
Is there a second?
I will second it. This is Shirley.
Shirley, great. So I have Carrie as a first and Shirley as a second, and we will move to a roll call vote. Amy.
Before voting, Melissa, discussion.
Sorry, is there any further discussion?
I still want to see a written plan of kind of protocol. I'm incredibly uncomfortable with the fact that we had 2 weeks to come up with a plan, and what was given to us today was not a plan. You know, I would like to see us revise our executive limitations, potentially to include during the pandemic that, you know, you will not be allowed to have more than a certain number of groups, you know, of cohort of a cohort size. I think that's really important piece that is potentially missing from this conversation. So come back to me, Melissa, because I still don't know that I'm a yay.
Okay, totally fair. Carrie.
Yes.
Yanette.
Yes.
Marcus.
Still in the high school situation. I'm just thinking in my head. Can you come back to me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Shamiko.
Shamiko, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm trying to wrap my brain around this. I need time to think.
Okay. Shirley.
Yes.
I am a yes. And then we'll come back to Amy and then Marcus and Shamik. Amy?
I don't have a lot of faith right now, like I said, given that we had concerns last time and they were not adequately addressed, and what was given to us is not acceptable. So, I mean, I would say I'm a conditional yes, but I still don't approve the lunch plan. I have to say nay because I cannot approve that lunch plan with the details being presented to us. It's a lack of details, an absence of details when there was time to prepare, and I'd had conversations saying, you know, this is kind of the expectation, and it seems like that was all kind of ignored until we got this board packet, and I'm really disappointed that that is the precaution that is being taken by the leaders in our district to protect our students and our public health. So I have to say I want the committee, but I cannot vote to approve that plan that was presented to us in our board book. It is not acceptable to me.
Okay. So that is an A. Marcus?
My piece is the high school piece in terms of, it seems like what high school students, it seems like where we have the most outbreak. Can we include them in that piece? Because I'm conditional is yes as well until we can get that that sussed out a little bit more. So I can't approve it, but I'm gonna abstain at this time because there's some stuff that needs to still be sussed out.
I think that abstentions in best practice have to be rooted in something other than, so yeah, I actually think that the best practice is that people either yay or nay, and that's fine.
Yeah, I know, but the thing for me is that I understand Amy's position. I understand Sumiko's position. My position is that if we're going to say we have this for elementary and middle school, we got to include high school within that, right? as well.
So the motion that Carrie made did not say K8.
It did not say K8, it did.
No, she did not. How I said it did, how she said it did not.
And Marcus, can I just get a little bit of clarification from you, because we didn't really talk about high schools today, and my understanding was that the reason is because high school students have had the option to be vaccinated, and so they are now, you know, the number one thing we can do to prevent spread, they have had the option to do. So can you just clarify?
Yes, they've had the option to be able to get vaccinated, but it seems like most of our outbreaks when it comes to most of our schools is always at the high school level. And that lets me know that a lot of people have not, in my mind, not taken it completely seriously in terms of make sure that they are protected as much as they can be. Me not being a healthcare professional, but actually living with one and talking these things out a lot, and looking at the population of those students who have been spreading a lot of this, it's just hard to say, and then want to add that into the verbiage as well. I'm gonna say nay at this time.
Yep. Shamiko?
Nay.
Motion passes 4-3 with Carrie, Yanette, Shirley, and myself as yay, and Amy, Marcus, and Shamiko as nay. We will now move forward, and just to make sure that I'm doing the right things, we are directing the school, the superintendent, to form an advisory panel that will review the plans moving forward.
And I would just add, as we build that out, we would intend to have all of our schools' plans reviewed so that it is K through 12, but we would prioritize elementary and middle as our starting places.
Thank you. So we are now going to, at 7:33, move into the work session, actual part of our evening. And thank you everybody for, obviously it is the beginning of the school year. And so normally a work session would be just that. It's just about information and us learning. And so a huge shout out to the team that is here to help us learn, for sitting through 2 hours of our deliberation on work that had to be taken care of tonight, because we need to open our schools and we had to have these discussions. But we are going to now pivot into our work session, and we are privileged to have Lauren Lester, Melinda Thomas, and Greg Colvin all here from High Desert Education Service District to help us understand both what they offer to us, understand our school board as a governance model, our legal duties, all the ins and outs of public records and public meetings, board interactions, conflict of interest, mandatory child abuse reporting, and hearings. And so just thank you for that team for being here for so long, and we can't wait to learn from you. So I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually, I'm going to try to move through this because I fear that you may not have much tolerance for some of the things that we've got to say at this particular hour. But one thing, I'm actually fortunate because I work with a couple of excellent lawyers, and that is Melinda and Lauren. I would like to at least have them just introduce themselves and a little bit of their background, if that would be all right. And we'll start with that, and then I'll jump into the agenda. I think you should have, at least we sent out earlier, the agenda, board orientation, some selected reference materials, document that is a guide for public officials from the Oregon Government Ethics Law, and then a policy for blocking or banning on social media. And so with that, if Lauren, if you go ahead and give a little background.
Sure, thanks, Greg. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm Lauren Lester. I started my law career in 2005 as a clerk for the Oregon Court of Appeals with Judge Linder, who then became a Oregon Supreme Court Justice and who is now retired. So that's starting to make me feel a little bit old. And then I moved from there to Carnott Peterson, a law firm in town in Bend, where I was for over 7 years, and I represented the Warm Springs tribes for the duration of my time there. And I've been with the ESD Legal Services Program here, representing school districts since 2014, so over 7 years now. So thanks, Greg.
Melinda.
And good evening, all. I'm Melinda Thomas. I've been in private practice in Oregon since 2005. I actually went to law school and graduated in 1993, so I'm kind of on the older end of things. But in Oregon, I've been practicing since 2005. I joined the High Desert ESD Legal Services Department in 2018. Before that, I was a partner at the local firm of Bryant, Loveland, and Jarvis, and I focused my practice on litigation and family law. But I also worked with Sharon, my former partner, Sharon Smith, who you all may know, and we served as outside counsel to Bend Lapine Schools. So I had a background in school law through that as well. And so I'm happy now to be working with Greg and Lauren and exclusively representing school districts.
Okay, and just a little bit about me. I've worked for a Seattle firm, actually clerked for a Seattle firm on a construction firm. Also clerked and worked for a Tigard law firm, construction firm. I opened a practice of my own in Central Oregon and had that for a period of years, left that for an opportunity to go practice law in New Zealand and worked for a law firm there. And came back, worked for Bryant, Emerson and Fitch, was a law firm out of Redmond, Oregon, left there approximately 17, 18 years ago, I think, roughly, and have been representing school districts ever since. The program that we have is one that was originally started by a gentleman by the name of John Whitty. John Whitty worked with Nancy Hungerford, that some of you may know, the Hungerford law firm. It was Nancy Hungerford, and then another John Bishop. They had a firm that did labor and employment work, mainly representing bargaining for a lot of various entities, including school districts. When the firm broke up, it was here in Central Oregon. John Whitty represented school districts in our region, basically Bend Lapine and Redmond, Sisters, Crook County. At some point, the districts asked that the firm, or that John moved to be an employee of the ESD. And the reason for that was to allow the districts to use what we called resolution dollars, which is now called local service plan dollars, to buy the legal services. And so that's how the legal services program originally became under the ESD program. It's expanded from when I started. What we do has expanded tremendously, and because we do general counsel work and we deal with all kinds of issues with school districts besides just bargaining, doing collective bargaining. We deal with employee issues, we deal with students issues, we deal with contract issues, family law issues to a huge extent, trying to sort through those type of things, as well as various other aspects of the legal program. We represent the districts here in this region, which is Jefferson County, Culver, Black Butte School District, which I think is probably a district of about 23 kids. And then we also represent Redmond, Sisters, Crook County, Bend Lapine, and then we do work for Milton Freewater, Sherman County School District, Prairie City School District, Malheur ESD, and also Burns. And so we cover the gamut. Some of our clients are actually non-union entities. Most of them are union entities. So that's kind of the background of the legal services program. I'm going to briefly just cover the governance model because you guys have already talked about it in your prior discussions. I mean, essentially, what the board does is they set out what I call, you call it ends, I call it the results that the board is looking for to be achieved. And then you put some limitations on how those can be achieved, or things that you can't do to achieve them. But then you hire the superintendent who you are directing to meet those goals. That's your expectation, is to have the superintendent hire the right people to do the job, but take whatever measures they deem appropriate to meet those goals. That's kind of the governance model. And what a way of I look at that, it's, I mean, an analogy is like you say, okay, Mr. Cook, we're directing you to make a chocolate cake, and we're telling you, yeah, don't use water in it. But we don't tell him what other ingredients to put in his cake, because otherwise it's not Mr. Cook's cake, it's our cake, right? It would be the board's cake. But we want to judge him on his cake, but we're saying we want it to be a good tasting chocolate cake or something like that. That's our goal. I know that's oversimplified, but in a sense, that's what we're telling them to do is, here's what we want to see. We want to see these results. You need to go out and get those for us. And we put some parameters around that. And you know, that's what you hire the superintendent. That's what you will evaluate them on, is to meet those needs. Now, I'm gonna move quick. So folks, I know this is late for you. That's why but if you have a question, holler at us. And I promise I'll start talking and I'll let these folks, my colleagues talk, which it'll probably be nice to have a change of tone. So school board is a legal entity. And what I mean by that, we're a body corporate. We can sue, we can be sued, right? That's what we're about. But one of the things I'd like to point out is, I got to tell you, and I say this, a nuclear power plant has nothing on us as far as how heavily regulated school districts are. We have a lot of regulations at the state level, at the federal level. We have constitutional regulations at the state level and the federal level. There's a lot of things that impact us. We have, you know, Title IX issues. We have 504. We have IDEA. IDEA. There's heaps of regulations over the school districts. And then, of course, as we're experiencing now in this pandemic, we have some emergency regulations that influence what we can or cannot do. And that's just, you know, that's just our lot in life. However, what I do want to spend a little time on is how the board conducts business. And the way that we do our work is in the board meeting. That's where we have our power, or the board has their power, is in the board meeting. Your power isn't individually necessarily out in the community. Now, that's important. Having those relationships, obtaining information from your constituents is important, but you don't have individual power. What you have is power, just like you exercised a moment ago, as you sit as the board. And you do that, you got to have a quorum. So we know we're a 7-member board. We got to have at least 4 people be present in order to conduct business. And the fact is, if all we had was 4 people, and we want to vote on something, all 4 have to vote for it. All 4 would have to be affirmative on whatever it is that we're voting for. If we had 3-1, even though we got a quorum, if it's 3-1, that's not sufficient. And so we wouldn't be able to move forward with that. So why is it important that we do our action, or that our power lies when we are sitting as a board? That is when we're acting in the scope and course of our employment. Now, why is that important? Well, there's an Oregon Tort Claims Act, right? The Oregon Tort Claims Act is actually an important thing, important to us individually, to board members individually, because as long as you're engaged in the scope and course of your employment, here, your job as a board member, and so long as you don't engage in willful or wanton neglect of duty or malfeasance in office, then you have protection under the Oregon Tort Claims Act. And what I mean by that is, somebody comes after you saying that you shouldn't have done this action. Well, the board has protection from the district. The district actually steps in and indemnifies and defends on behalf of the board. If we're not in that capacity, or if we engaged in willful and wanton neglect of duty or malfeasance in office, which which is conduct that is almost purposeful and reckless that you know is going to result in something that's not, I actually got strike that. It is generally it's purposeful or it's reckless. You knew or should have known that it would cause this result. But as long as you're not doing that, you're going to have protection. And that's legal protection. So if you were named in the lawsuit with the district, and that's often what can happen, they name all the board members, and the district steps in, has defense counsel for you, indemnifies you should there be a judgment that's not favorable. The other thing is we want to make sure that that board members. What do I want to say? We have to be careful. We want to follow certain laws and regulations, and Lauren's going to talk about that a bit more. Maybe I won't step on that, but it is important that because we can be individually liable if we operate outside the scope and course of our duties, or if we engage in a willful violation of our misconduct. If we do that, board members can have personal liability. And so we want to be mindful of that. And I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to actually let Lauren go and talk a little bit about public records. And so I'm sorry I'm moving fast, but if you have a question, you can ask it now. If you have a question later, you can ask it later, so we can let you get out of here at an early reasonable hour. And so, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I'm going to do the same and try to move through this pretty quickly. I'm going to talk about public records and public meetings, both topics of which I could spend a lot of time on. But like Greg, I do encourage you, if you do have questions, speak up, or we're available. So we're happy to answer questions that you have later as well. So I want to start with public records, and I want to start with just describing what a public record is. Because it's very broad under the public records law, and it includes any writing that contains information related to the conduct of the public's business. And so, like a good lawyer, you have to look for what the definition of a writing is, and it's quite broad. So it includes things like handwriting, typewriting, printing, photographing, every means of recording, including letters, words, pictures, sounds, symbols, or combinations thereof, all papers, maps, files, facsimile, or electronic recording. So that is, obviously a very broad definition. It includes, like I said, electronic communications. It includes text messages. It does not matter if it's on a personal device, your personal email address or your district email address. If it is information relating to the conduct of the public's business, it is a public record. So that's an important thing to bear in mind when you're talking about board business. It does not include things that do not relate to the conduct of the public's business and that are contained on a privately owned computer. So obviously, if your communications with your family and your friends that do not relate to the public's business, those are not public records that are subject to the public records law. But the presumption is that these public records are open to inspection. That is kind of the base premise of the Oregon Public Records Act. But there are a number of exemptions in the law. Some of them are what we call conditional exemptions, where we apply a balancing test, the public interest balanced against, the risks of disclosure, to the district's operations. And so there are a number of those set out in the statute. I won't go through them all now. And whenever we get a public records request, those are things that we analyze vis-a-vis a specific request. But some examples are like real estate appraisals, labor union cards. Another example are unfair labor practice investigations, archaeological site information. Those are conditional exemptions. There are also some unconditional exemptions as well, like personal information about employees as an example. And so, those are exemptions again that we apply when we get a request. So if you get a public records request, you have a public records policy. Every district does, and yours does as well. It follows the legal process, so it's a great thing to send people to that are asking for public records. Send them to that policy, and all public records requests should be funneled through the district office. So most districts, including yours, have a person that's designated to process public records requests. Usually, it's the superintendent's office, board secretary. And so you just want to make sure if you get a request, you want to give it to your public records officer, and then they will process it and and consult with us as appropriate in processing that request. So a couple of things to bear in mind. Even though the public records law is really broad, it does not require us to create records. If we don't have a record that is requested, we don't have to create it. So if, for example, somebody asks for, a detailed lunch menu for May 2022, and that's not something we have yet, then we don't have to create it just because somebody asked, right? That's just an innocuous example of something, but you can, you do have to provide non-exempt records that we do have in our possession, and so that's also important to bear in mind. So if you are asked to provide records that you have, you need to provide those, and then again we go through that exemption analysis. And it's actually a criminal offense to not disclose records, to knowingly disclose, not disclose records that are in existence, or to destroy them. But that being said, we're not required to keep records forever, right? And so it doesn't, I think there's a lot of confusion around how, what governs how long we keep records. And it's not the medium, right? So it's not like we have to keep memos for a certain amount of time. It's subject matter specific. So there's a retention law that's really, really detailed. They're in regulations that goes through in detail what kinds of records need to be kept for a certain amount of time. And so it's the subject matter of the record that governs how long we have to keep those records. And so if you have any, specific questions about that, you're welcome to ask, and we can go through the regulation. But again, you provide records that you have in your possession, and then we can go through that exemption analysis and make sure you get the biggest takeaway for you all is to make sure if you get a public records request that you funnel it over to the district, so that there are some timelines involved under the public records law and your policy that are important. So, and then we also have, if you get, requests for student records or personnel records, those are protected records. And so we have specific laws that apply to those. So those aren't, student records typically, with some exceptions, aren't generally disclosable other than to the parent. And then personnel records, you have a policy actually that governs personnel records, and they may also be addressed in your collective bargaining agreement as well, as to when we can disclose personnel records and to whom. So again, that's policy driven, and those aren't just things that we give out to everyone. Okay, so I'm going to move on to public meetings. And Greg touched on this a little bit, but again, it's kind of the same theme that we talked about with public records, in that it's a sunshine law, right? And so it is intended to allow the public to be aware of the deliberations and the decisions of the school board and information on which the decisions are made. So it really is intended to ensure that decisions are arrived at openly and that the public has the opportunity to observe what that process is. And so what is a decision? So that's defined by law, and it's a determination, action, vote, or final disposition on any motion, proposal, resolution, order, ordinance, or measure on which a vote of a governing body is required at any meeting which a quorum is present. So those are the things that are governed by, the public meetings law. And it can even apply if you're receiving information about a decision that you're going to make at a later point. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, something you're voting on that night, but something that you might vote on eventually. That should be discussed in a public meeting. It doesn't apply to social gatherings or gatherings to discuss matters outside of the district's jurisdiction. We regularly have board members attend, a quorum of the board attend conferences and trainings. You got to be careful at those types of things not to discuss district business, but it doesn't mean you're prohibited from attending those things. So that's an important distinction to make. My biggest caution for board members on this, public meeting requirement are serial communications, and that's cereal with an S. You can still eat the cereal as long as it's not with more than 2 board members. But anyway, so those occur when a quorum of the board is deliberating towards a decision outside of the public meeting, so outside of a public meeting, serially. So meaning not necessarily they're getting together, with 4 people, right, over coffee and talking about something that's going to come before the board. But it can occur when board members are, one board member communicates with one, and then the other one communicates with another one, and so you're essentially, deliberating with more than, with a quorum or more of the board about a decision, even if it's not simultaneously, if that makes sense. So you want to be really mindful of those types of communications, because again, the way I like to conceptualize this is, am I depriving the public of the opportunity to see how we are arriving at a decision, right? And if you're communicating with one another about something, and again, with a quorum or more, then you're depriving the public of that opportunity. You need to keep your discussions to the board meeting, which is kind of refreshing, right? So if you see each other out and about, you don't feel like you need to talk about board business, right? You can talk about what your kids are up to or whatever. So I caution you about that. That's just something really important to bear in mind in our electronic age. Oh, Greg.
So there is case law on this one. We actually can thank Eugene County Commissioners for a case that actually went up to the Court of Appeals, where they found a serial communication, and essentially it stemmed from an individual by the last name was Handy, who had sent out a letter to constituents seeking to get money to help towards an attorney fee bill that he had, and the remaining commission engaged in discussions that amounted to a serial meeting. The reason why Handy was looking for money to help towards the attorney fee bill is because he was found to have violated the public meetings law previously, and was found to be individually liable. And that's why he had this bill that he was trying to take care of. And so it's something that you got to pay attention to. And it can be, you can do multiple combinations of getting there, meaning you can do stuff in person. You could do it probably through social media. You can do it through email, but it can amount to, if you are one, not even deciding, but deliberating towards a decision on something that's going to be before the board. So you have to be mindful about this stuff. We're not going to know. But if you have a question, ask it. And Carrie's got a question for you.
So I have kind of a hypothetical example that I just want to ask about this discussion about topics that could be a decision. Because there's so many educational topics that are also just sort of interesting public discourse. So say we were at a city club event and a quorum of us was sitting at a table and someone brought up an article in the New York Times about a new study on standardized testing, and who knows, something about education that theoretically could be something that the board might discuss at some time in the future to make a decision about standardized testing. Can we not talk about sort of, current events or educational research or, something interesting we read that's not about a decision that we're making right now, but that could possibly be a decision at some point?
So Carrie, that's a great question. And it's not tended to be that, circumspect, right? So I think it really is around things that are reasonably foreseeable to come before the board, or that you're voting on, or that I think things that you don't have a reasonable belief at that particular time that you're going to be asked to vote on in a coming board meeting. I think, and you're going to have to make a judgment call on that, right? But no, I don't think it's meant to include any sort of educational topic, right? But more around like, if you've got an impending real estate deal, or if you, are going to be deciding on a reopening plan, or these types of things, that are coming before you and that you're going to have to make a decision on, or that say you have to make an annual decision on, right? So that these things are things that you have to make a decision on every year. I would avoid sort of deliberating. And again, it's really around, am I depriving the public of my thoughts, my sort of the information and my thoughts on which I am basing my decision, right? Does that help? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. And the difference between having 4 of you and 3 of you, so just to be explicitly clear, if 3 of us were at an event and one of us had just read, again, an interesting article on a topic that may be relevant to board discussion, and we're just discussing the article or the research, and there's 3 of us, is that okay?
So yes, as long as none of you talk to any of the other board members, right? So you want to keep that, that discussion among, but it's tricky, right? So if it's 3 of you talking, that's not a quorum of the board. But if one of you goes and talks to another board member about it, then you've created that quorum. So, so that's where these get really tricky and get trickier, right? As we communicate with one another more and more on various mediums. So
yeah. And then does it matter if you then commit to having that same discussion in public?
I would say no. I mean, not under the, I think it's helpful, right? You're recreating this discussion essentially. I just would caution you against it. Yeah, I just, I mean, I see what your point, and it's well taken, in that, you're still.
If you were like, oh, I just read this interesting article, let's chat about it for a minute, and then we're like, oh, we should make sure that we have, that we bring this discussion to the public meeting so that others can hear it as well.
Right. And again, if it's an interesting article that's not about something that's coming before you for decision, then, I don't think you've got a problem. But if it's something that you have reasonably believe you're going to have to take a vote on, like, then that would be a different story.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about notice. So what makes the meeting, public? How do we let the public know? We have to give them notice of the time and place of regular meetings that's reasonably calculated to provide actual notice to the persons and the media that have stated in writing they want to be notified, even if it's only an executive session. So you still have to notice out executive sessions, even if folks aren't, permitted to attend. The notice has to include a list that's sufficiently descriptive of the principal subjects that you're anticipating to be considered, but it doesn't limit your ability to consider additional subjects. You can amend the agenda, and you can even have an executive session. If you feel the need to call an executive session during your board meeting, you can do that as long as you notice it properly at that time. So with executive sessions, you have to include a specific legal provision. So under the law, again, the presumption is openness, right? The presumption is that all public business is going to be conducted out in the open. And so there are some certain topics on which you can that you can discuss in executive session that are set out in the statute. So, it's ORS 192660 if you feel like reading it, but usually you're consulting with us, right, about whether an executive session is appropriate. But things would include like meeting with your labor negotiator, meeting with your real estate, if you've hired someone to negotiate a real estate transaction for you, meeting about pending litigation, meeting to discuss exempt public records and information, so under which you can receive legal advice, for example. We could come talk to you and advise you on a particular legal topic, because that, you know, information, that memo or whatever we provide to you would be attorney-client privileged. And so it would be an exempt public record that we could discuss with you in executive session. So, so those are the types of meetings, and that you have to notice the specific provision, and you have to keep the discussion in executive session to that particular topic. So the media can actually report out on things that you talk about in executive session that are beyond the scope of what the executive session was called for, that are inappropriate for an executive session. The media can actually attend most executive sessions unless it's consulting with your labor negotiator, or unless you're considering a student expulsion. Those can be heard in executive session. And the media is not permitted to attend, or if the media is a party to litigation that you're discussing with a lawyer. So I don't know, that doesn't happen very often, but if that were to occur, they wouldn't be allowed to attend your executive session. So, you know, in executive session, you're often discussing confidential information, and you want to keep that information confidential. In the example of consulting with your lawyers, by disclosing things that are discussed in that executive session, you could be effectively waiving the attorney-client privilege, and that should be done by the board as a whole, not by an individual board member, if that makes sense. So, so you just want to be mindful of keeping, you know, if you're talking about personnel information is confidential. If you're talking about that in executive session, you want to hold that information in confidence. The one thing you can't do, with a couple of exceptions, in executive session is make a final decision or final action. This can get tricky in terms of not divulging confidential information as you take the action, but also making sure that you take actions out in the public. So, and what is a final decision? It's actually not defined in the statute, but you know, the Attorney General has written a really good guide on public records and public meetings. And so it is actually online. You can search it online if you ever want to look this stuff up. They have some really, you know, great guidance, and we consult it all the time when we advise districts. But their guidance around what a final decision is that, you know, a governing body should consider two criteria: the nature of the proposed decision and the purpose of the authorization for the particular executive session. And, you know, unless it's reasonably likely that the type of decision or action proposed can be made in executive session, the governing body, you guys should return to open session. For example, it's highly unlikely that any decision authorizing the expenditure of funds could be made in executive session. But if, you know, if you're looking at the proposed action and it doesn't resolve the finality question, you should consider whether public announcement of the proposed decision or action actually would frustrate the policy under which the statutory, you know, authorization for the executive session is. And so the way that we kind of get around, and not get around this, but, you know, is sometimes we will craft a motion in such a way that, you know, puts the public on notice of a decision, but doesn't include some of that protected information. And I know that sounds really amorphous right now without a specific example, but usually, you know, we're happy to advise you on how to strike that balance. One important decision that you can make in executive session is expulsion. So you sit, you know, under your board policy as, you know, as essentially an appeals body to hear, you know, if an expulsion is appealed to you. And those decisions can be made in executive session for obvious reasons. You know, this is not information that we want out in the public around student expulsion. So those don't happen all that often, but they occasionally do get to the board. So you know, the executive session law is enforced by OGC, and there are civil penalties for not following it, unless you act up to $1,000, unless you act on the advice of counsel. So I do encourage you to seek the advice of counsel when you're looking at doing an executive session, and we can advise you on whether or not it's appropriate to have one. So with that, I'm going to go to Greg to talk about social media use. Any questions? I'm sorry, I know I just blew through that stuff really quickly, but okay. And if you think of any later, let us know.
Yeah. So my colleagues probably think it's a little funny for me to be talking about social media. It's not necessarily something I actively participate in much, but it is interesting from the legal perspective. And I'm going to just address one particular issue with you folks, and that's it's case Davison v. Randall, which was a Fourth Circuit case. and it happened to involve, it was allowed in school district. It involved the board chair of the district who had a Facebook page and blocked a constituent from stating essentially that the board had a conflict of interest and that the board was corrupt. And so litigation was filed by that constituent. And ultimately, the court said that that action was viewpoint discrimination and that the individual's account was a public forum. And that's what can happen sometimes is you have what you think may be your own account, but it morphs into a public forum. And when it does that, it takes on a different persona and has different regulations that are associated with that. And you can get in trouble if you start preventing people that have a different viewpoint from being able to post on that. So that's something you just need to be careful about. And so factors that the courts could look at to see if it's a public forum is, is the page identified as that as the official? Is it Greg Colvin school board member? That's going to be one of the indicia the court would look at. Does a page describe and advertise as the account of the public official? Is the page run by the public's office? Now, probably in our situation, most of the time, if there's a page, it's not being run by staff members. It's probably being run by individual board members to the extent that you have that. Does the board person use the page to make official announcements or statements or policy proposals? Is it a tool for the official to communicate with the public or constituents out in the public? Or is it something that's open to comments and communication by the general public? And so that can be something where you could have an account that can morph into where it is a public forum, and you're going to have to allow some people sometimes to say certain things. Now, certain things you may not agree with, right? That could be in opposition to your view. And so you need to be careful. One of the things that we provided in our packet was just a document. It doesn't mean you don't have any control. And here's what I'm getting at by that statement is that you don't have to allow somebody to come on and engage in profanity or to threaten the office or have them seen pictures or those type of things. That's not okay, and it's not acceptable. And so the one document that we provided, it just says policy for blocking or banning. That's probably something, if you have an account that you use your official account, I would encourage you to consider looking at having that type of policy stated there so people know that they come on if they engage in those type of conduct. Then you can look at blocking that individual or banning or taking down the comment if it meets some of that criteria, which is viewpoint neutral criteria. And so this is going to be fact specific, you guys. And so if you have something you need to talk about it, let's talk about it. But just in general, that's how that works. Now, there's other cases out there. I don't know that there's a Ninth Circuit case, which Oregon's under the Ninth Circuit, but there's other cases. And I just believe that if there were factual scenario like the one of Davison, that I think our courts would fall right in line with that decision. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Greg, can I ask a question on that statement? I feel like this policy for blocking or banning is less than what we have posted on the BLS Facebook page, or what Bend City Council is using, and I pulled from both of those when I put my own statement on my Facebook page. So, for example, discriminatory and racist comments aren't included in this, and so I'm curious whether if this is the benchmark we should be using as a board, or whether we should be using what BLS uses on their Facebook page.
So what I, in full disclosure, I pulled this from a document that we have, and actually we got permission that if you're interested to receive it, it's actually a document that's was produced for the Council of School Attorneys in, I think, 2020. I believe, at a seminar, and that was just one of the publications that was, I'm sorry, one of the examples that was contained in that document. And so, you know, is that the benchmark, I think is what you said, Melissa, and I don't know where you went. Oh, there you are.
I'm right here.
Yeah.
I feel like that's it's less than we already have posted for Ben Lapine schools, and I even think that maybe we could strengthen.
Well, we might be able to add on to it, and as cases develop, that may also expand the what we can add on to. At least I just wanted to at least give something, so at least you would have something if that's what you're doing or interested in doing, that you have a document there. We can certainly look at an individual policy, and I haven't looked at your Facebook policy if you have one. It sounds like you do. You do. And so I haven't looked at it, Melissa, but I would say you want at least what we have.
Okay, maybe I'll follow, and Julianne, just maybe follow up with what at least what BLS has as its minimum right now, just as a benchmark for folks within the district, and make sure it's okay with you legally.
Sure. And then if you're interested in more information, I know this is getting late, but we do have this document that just talks about, it's just titled Social Media Meets Local Politics. Is your page a public forum? And we did get permission that we could share that. If that's something you're interested, just let us know and we can provide that to you. So that's all I've got to say about that. And we need to allow Melinda to talk about some important aspects of boardsmanship.
All right, thanks, Greg. So I've been asked to talk about, how board members interact as individuals and among themselves as a board, and some of the best practices. And then I'll move on to some confidentiality issues, and then some ethics and conflicts issues that you need to be taking into account. And so the first part of this is just really carrying on the theme that Greg talked about early on, which is that you are a member of a board. You are elected to be a part of that board and not elected to make policy or take actions as an individual. You're authorized only to act in the context of an official meeting, as Lauren kind of outlined what that looks like. And you're not in a position to commit the board to a particular action or direction. And that also means, and you can't take independent action on your own as well. And that really means that includes giving direction to the superintendent or the staff. And so your vote is your power. That's where your authority lies. And even if the full board takes a vote and you don't agree with the final action of the board, effective boardsmanship requires you to support the ultimate decision of the board, even if you don't agree. You're in a position to be able to voice the minority opinion when voting on an issue, but then support the majority position or the majority vote outwardly towards the community. And so the public meeting and your vote is where your power and authority lies. Now, that's not something that community members and community groups often, sometimes they don't understand what the limits of your authority are. And so they may come to you. In fact, you've probably already been in this position, I would guess, given our current climate. I'm sure that they've come to you or will come to you with an issue that they're hoping or expecting that you can act on their behalf to resolve. But because you can't commit the board to any specific action, nor can you act independently, you've got to remember that. And your response can be that, a school board sets standards through policy and through their vote. And we have a specific governance model in Ben Lapine that it's clear that you're already aware of and versed on. But through that, you don't manage the day-to-day operations of the district. That's what the superintendent and the staff is tasked with. And because of that, because you operate at that higher, I would say 30,000 foot level, you should never promise to step in. You should never, if somebody approaches you and asks you to, hey, here's my pet issue and I want you to do this for me or help me get resolution, be very careful and avoid stepping in or to promise them that you can resolve an issue, because you don't have that independent individual authority to do that. And what I would suggest is that you refer, if there's a complainant bringing you a specific issue, then you would refer the complainant to the chain of command and to the district's complaint policies and ARs, which we have. And they're all on, as you likely all know, all of the district's policies and administrative regulations are posted on the website under the school board tab. And so I would also caution you to avoid getting sucked into conversations that reveal too many details or cause the person that's talking to you to talk too much about the details of their issue. And the reason why is because you need to preserve your role as an unbiased board member if the issue later comes before you, before the school board. You don't want to give the impression that you've, you know, prejudged an issue or are not, you know, prejudging an issue or not biased when it ultimately does come before the school board, if it does. Under your policies, you do have several board policies that talk about what your role as a school board member are. They're under the board governance process section of your policies online. The three that are relevant to what I'm talking about here, you've got the code is GP2. It's about board job descriptions, and it gives you some more information about what your roles and responsibilities are. There's GP3, that's your board code of conduct. And then there's GP4, which is your board ethics and conflicts of interest policy. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that here shortly. But I really encourage you to go through those board governance policies, be familiar with them, read them, know what your role is, what you can and can't do. It's probably more technical than you were expecting when you were running for the school board, but now that you're school board members, these are the policies that govern your conduct and your responsibilities and your roles. I would like to take up just a quick take off of what Gray was talking about with social media and your online activity. I know that comes up a lot, and it has come up recently. As a board member, you don't give up your right to express personal opinions. But when you do that, you need to take care to clarify that those are your personal opinions or perspectives, and that they're not offered in your capacity as a school board member. So you need to make sure in all of your messaging, on your online social media posting, online activity, that you draw that distinction and make that clear. You should also avoid giving the impression that you've already made your mind up on an individual or on an issue that is before the board, before it's been resolved, because again, your power is your vote and your authority is your vote. But your duty is to listen to all the facts, collect the facts, and hear different perspectives, and then thoughtfully make up your mind on how you're going to vote. So you don't want to give the impression that you're relinquishing that responsibility by sharing too much of your personal opinion and making it seem as though you've already made up your mind on some issue like that. So I'm going to move into quickly on confidentiality. Lauren touched on this a little bit. In your capacity as a school board member, you will be presented with confidential information about students or staff. Usually it will occur in the context of a hearing of some sort that Lauren is going to talk about in a little bit. You'll come across protected student information. And you need to know that public school districts, their staff and board members are subject to FERPA, which is the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act, and that protects the privacy of student records. Generally, it requires written consent from parents or students who are of age themselves to release personally identifiable information from the student's education record, and that would include things like disciplinary content, which you may come into contact with through a hearing, like an expulsion hearing. FERPA has a couple of specific exceptions to that, but they mostly or generally don't apply to school board members. And so I'm not going to spend time going over that tonight. But you do need to know that school board members are subject to FERPA, and your obligation is to keep information about students confidential. Similarly, personnel information is confidential under Oregon employment laws. And so everything that you hear or anything personnel, just be careful. That's not information to be disclosing. All right, sorry I'm going so quickly here, but I know your time is, we're going long in the night. I'm going to talk a bit about board member ethics and conflicts right now. And so as an elected official, you occupy a position of public trust and you are subject to Oregon government ethics laws. Most of those laws are found in ORS Chapter 244. And they are administered and enforced by, as Lauren mentioned, the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, or OGEC is the acronym for that agency. OGEC has put out a publication that's in the materials that you've been provided tonight, and it's called A Guide for Public Officials. And I'm going to go through some of the highlights of that now, but I want to point out that guide for public officials to you because I think, especially in the political climate that we're in now and the division within the community and the pressures that you all are under, it's going to be really important that you understand what your ethical obligations are and what prohibitions you have and restrictions you have on what you can and can't do and what types of conflicts of interest, because you guys are under a microscope now like I've never seen since I've been, working in school law. So I really encourage you to take a look at that guide for public officials and have a copy of it handy so that you can turn to. And also OGEC staffs an ethics hotline that you can call. I should have the number right here, but it's on the OGEC website. You can find it easily and they're great. If you have a hypothetical, you can call them and just say, hey, not sure how to proceed in this situation hypothetically or even in real time. So make sure, you just remember that that's a really important resource for you. Now, having said that, you have personal responsibility for knowing and managing your ethical obligations and your conflicts of interest. What that means is the consequences for violating those ethics rules are personal to you. And Greg, Lauren, and I, we represent the school board and the school district as a whole. And that means that we can't advise you as individual board members on your ethical obligations and your responsibilities. When something comes up and you aren't certain about something, go back to that guide for public officials, call the ethics hotline. Depending on the situation, you may want to retain your own attorney. Hopefully you don't have anything that sticky, but it's an option for you. We can provide a very high level review of some of the most important considerations, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my time here. But just be aware that this is personal to you. The district's not going to defend you or indemnify you. It's your personal obligation to know what your ethical obligations are and to follow them. So as kind of described in the guide for public officials, there's a number of prohibitions and restrictions on what you can and can't do as a board member. I'm going to go quickly through them. It's dry and I'm going to mostly read from my page in front of me because it's pretty wordy too. But there's 5 of them that I'll go over, and this is not an exclusive list. There are more in the guide for public officials, but these are the ones that kind of come up the most and kind of the highlights from that. So you cannot use or attempt to use your public position to obtain a financial benefit for yourself, a relative, or a household member for your own personal gain or that of your relative or household member if the financial benefit would not otherwise be available but for the position you hold as a public official. An example is, you can't use a district vehicle to move personal belongings because you wouldn't have access to that personal vehicle, which gives you a financial gain. You don't have to go out to U-Haul and rent a truck or a trailer. So that's a financial gain, and you wouldn't have access to that, the district's vehicle, but for your position as a board member. You can't attempt to use confidential information that is not available to the general public for your own personal gain or that of a relative or a household member. And this will follow you even after you finish your term of office as a board member. So an example would be if you gain knowledge through your position as a board member that, maybe there's a district contractor that's struggling to satisfy its contractual obligations with the district, and maybe the contract is maybe on the verge of being terminated or modified somehow, and maybe you have a relative or a household member that provides a similar type of a service. You can't share information with your household member or your relative that, hey, we might be having problems. So here, in helping your relative or household member prepare a proposal to present to the district. This is a little bit in the weeds, but when public officials own or are associated with a business that may need to appear before the school board on behalf of a paying client, so say an architect who represents, a contractor or a client who wants some business from the school district, you can't appear for your client, but another person from the business could. This rarely comes up in the school district context, but it's possible. You can't participate in personnel actions that would impact the paid employment of a relative or a household member. And you can't receive gifts exceeding an aggregate value of $50 per calendar year from a source that has an interest in the decisions of the votes of you as a public official. And so you got to watch that, and be careful about that. I mean, it really, gifts can include dinners, paid dinners or coffee or whatever, and $50 isn't much. So you got to be really careful about that. So now I'm going to move on to conflicts of interest. This is the last part I have here. There's two types of conflicts of interest that impact public officials. There are actual conflicts and potential conflicts. An actual conflict exists when you as a public official participates in an official action, decision, or a recommendation, some action of the school board that would affect your financial interest or that of a relative or a household member or an associated business. So it would impact or would benefit you, or even negatively benefit you, to be honest. A potential conflict exists, same blurb, but when you participate in an official action or decision or recommendation that could impact your financial interest or that of a relative or a household member or an associated business. And so the difference between an actual and a potential conflict is that word would or could. So would, it actually does impact your financial interest, and could, it may. So that's the difference between the two types of conflict of interest. Regardless of the type of conflict of interest, if you have either an actual or a potential conflict of interest, you have to publicly disclose the nature of that conflict before participating in any allowable official action on the issue giving rise to the conflict. And what that means is that you have to disclose your actual or potential conflict in a public meeting or through some other means that is reasonably calculated to inform the public. So what does this mean if you have a conflict? If you have an actual conflict, you must refrain from further participation in any official action of the board on the issue. There's one exception to that, and that is if your vote is necessary to meet the minimum number of votes for the action, then you can vote on it, but you cannot participate in the deliberations leading up to the vote. If you have a potential conflict, you can participate in the deliberations and you can vote on the issue giving rise to the conflict, but you just still have to disclose it before doing so. So that's a mouthful, a lot of technical dry stuff. That's the end of my section here. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Well, you guys are an easy crowd now.
No, they're tired. So that's what Melinda was talking about at the last part there is that would be your case where you had just 4 of you show up to a meeting and it would take 4 to do the action. That would just be one of those things I would sure ask you to consider whether or not that's even something you'd want to do if you actually have that conflict that Melinda's talking about. Might be better to wait till next meeting. So I'm going to just hit you with mandatory child abuse reporters. Yep, you joined the club, although I look at most of you, and I think most of you are probably already in that group anyway, based on your employment. And so, but not everybody, but out of the 2019 legislation, school board members were added to the list. You're a mandatory reporter, 24/7 obligation. And what I mean by that, you're at the grocery store on a Saturday, and if you observe child abuse, you have an obligation to report it. We are required to report it to either law enforcement or to DHS. The definition for abuse, I'm not going to go into it. Most of you probably know it. If you want it, we can send it to you. Excuse me, it's contained under ORS 419B 005 in that list of stuff. Good faith reporting. If you make a good faith report, there is immunity. Failure to report is a Class A violation. And the responsibility is personal to you as the individual. You can't rely on somebody else to do it. So that's all I'm going to say. If you have any particular questions, holler out, reach out later. We're happy to talk to you about it. Or if you ever have a question about a particular situation, and this can get tough, and it involves a friend or something like that, it gets tough, but you still have the obligation. So I'm going to stop talking and let Lauren take you home.
And Greg, just to clarify, everybody should have received a ping as a board member for the mandatory training that we have to do.
Yeah, you have the training. It's just something that we got to remember. It's every day, all day.
Okay, so I have to laugh whenever we do these because as the lawyers we're like, oh, we're gonna just fly through this and we'll be really quick, and then you guys are probably sitting there like, oh my goodness. So we're a wordy bunch. So anyway, but I actually will be quick on hearings, and all I'm going to say about hearings is that sometimes the board sits, mostly you sit as a policy making body, but sometimes you sit in a quasi-judicial capacity by virtue of your policies. And so, and also, your collective bargaining agreement, grievance procedure potentially, so you can sit on, hear an expulsion hearing, a complaint hearing, a probation, you can hear a hearing on a probationary licensed staff member dismissal or non-renewal, other staff demotion or dismissal. So there are times when you are asked to listen to evidence, consider evidence, and make a decision. And so, and Melinda touched on this before, and so I won't go into a lot of detail again, but that's why sometimes, we have to strike a balance between keeping the board informed about issues like this, but also ensuring that you are able, that we avoid a pretext argument, which means so much about the issue that you're not actually considering the evidence and making a decision in that hearing, right? That you have already made a decision and you're going in not with an open mind and not, and so so sometimes we want to kind of shield you from some of those details so that you can sit, if it comes to you, as that quasi judicial body. So I just want to make you aware of that. These may come up from time to time, not often, but they do come up from time to time. And so it's just something you should be aware of. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say about here. Oh, Greg, see, what?
I'm just going to say, look, this is a difficult dance because the board never wants to be surprised by the superintendent. Right. And the superintendent never wants to be surprised by the board, but you have to find a median in there where you can work so we don't get involved in a pretext argument, because that is not good.
Yeah, which is pretty much what I think I just said, but no, just kidding. But we have to repeat ourselves. Anyway. Well, with that, thank you so much for hanging in with us. And I can't imagine having to listen to this at almost 9 o'clock at night. So thanks for inviting us and bearing with us as we give all this information to you and let you digest it. So any other comments, questions? Just want to get out of here.
Thank you. As a former paralegal, this is my favorite part of the meeting.
Yeah, that's very rare. I think most folks find this kind of dry, but it's important from our perspective. But I'm glad to hear that. So it's good to see you.
I would echo just Lauren and Melinda and Greg, thank you so much. I was starting to put things in the chat like, this is such an important section, but just really, this is such critical information. So thank you for bearing with us on a long night and helping us make sure that we're doing and fulfilling all of the duties that we signed up for. So really appreciate you.
Thank you.
With that, if there aren't any more questions for our legal team, I'm going to move us into board comments, and I am going to go through like I have been in alphabetical first name order. So if there are final board comments, we'll start with Amy.
No, I have nothing else to add. I am exhausted. My smoke alarms at my house went off 5 times last night at a cadence of about 30 to 45 minutes each, starting at 10:30. So I had maybe 3.5 hours of sleep. So I want the meeting to be over. I love all of you and I'm exhausted. See you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Amy. Carrie?
Nothing further from me tonight. Thank you, Melissa and everyone.
Yanette?
Nothing for me. Thank you, everyone.
Marcus?
Thanks, everyone. I'm going on vacation.
Shamiko?
No comment tonight.
Shirley?
Just a quick comment. I am so pleased about the total support for the distribution of free school supplies to all of our kiddos. I think that is an extremely brilliant idea. Don't know where it came from, but thank you, staff, for considering that and implementing it.
Thanks, Shirley. Sorry, I have 2 quick ones, just because I like to report out on work that we're doing. One, very excited about the Heart of Oregon Awards that happened last week. And if you're not familiar with the cores, they provide summer experiences for students to develop a passion, a purpose, and a pathway through multiple places in our community, forestry, Madras thrift store, etc. And so really an amazing program and excited for them. And then second, just wanted to say that I had the privilege of being on a call with Governor Brown, some other board chairs, and then the Color Caucus from OSBA, and just wanted to share publicly that the 2 things that I really asked for in my time were ensuring that restrictions that affect children's education are the last deployed in our community, and that adults are always required to do the same. And that comes from a place of really wanting our schools to be in person every day, full time. And then also second, ensuring a focus on DEI and doing that on 2 fronts. One, as a state, really addressing the concerted effort and attack that's been happening on BIPOC board members across our state, as well as locally, and then ensuring that the DEI work that was supposed to happen and was prioritized under SIA dollars and funding is not diluted, and that spending continues to stay aligned with those priorities. So that was a great discussion with Governor Brown. I found her very receptive, and that's my report out of what I've been doing the last couple of weeks. So with that, if there are no further comments, then I will adjourn our very long work session for August 24th. Thank you.